Hello friends, about of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be really happy if you do so. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comments. Your interaction makes the content reach everyone and contributes to the growth of the channel. Thank you. My name's Alex. I'm 30 years old, and I'm about to tell you what happened to me and my buddy Ben out in this freaky place called Devil's Den, south of Flagstaff, Arizona. And let me tell you, if you're expecting some ghost story or some cheap jump scares, you can forget it. This stuff is way too real for me. I still have nightmares about it, and I swear I'd give anything to go back and change our minds about camping there. I'd been hyped for this trip for weeks. See, I love the outdoors. Always have. Growing up, I spent summers hiking with my dad in places like Sedona and the Grand Canyon. Ben, my friend, who's 28, hadn't done as much of that stuff, but he was always up for an adventure. He was also kinda into conspiracy theories. You know, the type who's always going on about UFOs or haunted forests. If there was some creepy rumor going around, Ben had probably read about it like 10 times. He went through life with this weird mix of fascination and, like, total dread. It could be tiring, but I liked hanging out with him. So, I heard about Devil's Den from this old coworker, a guy who loved to brag about these super remote, backcountry spots. He said it was like this isolated paradise. Thick woods, hardly any trails, and zero cell service. Basically, the perfect place to get away from all the noise and crap of modern life. The name alone got me interested. But when I mentioned it to Ben, he went all pale. I read something about Devil's Den, he said. It's supposedly full of, like, weird symbols and messed up legends. I just laughed it off. I mean, legends are just stories, right? We decided on a 4-day trip, just to unplug and chill. If Ben had any doubts, they were definitely getting drowned out by his curiosity. We drove out early on a Friday morning, taking my beat-up old SUV, which we loaded up with supplies and one of those roof racks for extra cargo. Devil's Den was a good drive from Flagstaff. Once we got off the main highway, the roads got rough, and the last 15 miles were just this packed dirt that turned into a bumpy trail. We parked under a bunch of tall pines and just took in the view. I remember stepping out of the car and feeling the silence of the forest just wash over me. The wind was rustling the pine needles overhead, and there was this faint, almost damp smell in the air. It reminded me of rainy days in the mountains with my dad, except something felt off. I couldn't explain it, so I just tried to ignore it. Ben slammed the car door and groaned. "Man, this place is quiet," he muttered, looking at the trees like they might jump out and grab him. "It's perfect," I said. "We'll set up camp a bit deeper in." We grabbed our packs and started walking. The trail, if you could even call it that, was barely there. Just a faint hint of flattened plants. I used a compass and a rough map to guide us to a spot that was supposed to have a natural clearing and a little stream nearby. When we finally found it, it was almost noon. The place looked totally untouched. A ring of tall pines around a wide patch of level ground, with some scattered boulders that we could use as seats around a campfire. We set up 2 tents. Ben's old tent, which I later found out had a broken pole, and my own, which was sturdier. After we unloaded, I realized we'd have to share one tent. Ben's was missing a rod that held it up. He cursed under his breath, but I figured it was no big deal. We'd just store our extra gear in the broken tent and both sleep in mine. The day passed without anything weird happening. We gathered firewood, found the stream, which was more like a trickle of water, and just took in the forest. Ben kept looking over his shoulder like he was convinced we weren't alone, but I told him it was probably just wildlife. You know, raccoons, foxes, maybe a bear if we were really unlucky. But deep down, I felt it too. Something was wrong. The place was too quiet. The usual hum of insects and birds in the distance seemed muted, like the forest itself was holding its breath. That night, we built a small campfire and roasted hot dogs. The embers crackled, and sparks floated up into the night. With no city lights around, the stars were amazing. For a while, everything felt perfect, and Ben relaxed enough to tell some jokes. We turned in around 11, totally exhausted from the hike. Then, in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of someone, or something, laughing. At first, I thought Ben was messing with me, but his sleeping bag was zipped up tight, and he looked dead asleep. The laugh was faint, almost like a high-pitched giggle, but it echoed strangely through the trees. I strained to hear it again, but it stopped. Minutes passed in silence. I finally drifted back to sleep, blaming it on the wind or some animal in the distance. The next morning, Ben seemed on edge. He said he dreamt of shadows moving around outside the tent. I didn't tell him about the laughter. I didn't want to freak him out more. We made some coffee over the fire, then decided to explore. The plan was simple. Hike a loop around the area, see if there were any cool spots, and mark our route so we wouldn't get lost. We hadn't gone far when we stumbled across an old campsite. It looked abandoned, but not for long. There were empty cans with fresh rust, half-burned logs, and a cold fire pit. But what really creeped us out was the tree behind it. There was this weird, jagged pentagram carved into the bark, and around it were these strange shapes, like runes or symbols. I had no idea what they were. Ben was practically shaking. "This is what I'm talking about," he said, his voice trembling. "Weird stuff. People doing rituals or something. Probably just some local kids messing around." I replied, trying to sound casual, but I felt a knot forming in my stomach. We didn't stick around. Before leaving, we noticed that whoever happed camp there left in a hurry. There was unpacked gear scattered around, including old cigarette butts with lipstick smudges on them. It was like they'd just vanished, like the forest had swallowed them whole. That's when the bad vibes really started to kick in. Back at our campsite that afternoon, we found that our food had been messed with. It was subtle at first. A few energy bars missing, some beef jerky packets opened. We thought maybe an animal got into it, but the tracks in the dirt looked human, though not entirely. They were narrow footprints, almost child-sized, but the toes were weirdly long. That's when Ben really started to lose it. He wanted to leave right then and there. I tried to calm him down, saying it was probably just some hiker passing through, or maybe some teenager's prank. We argued for almost an hour. His voice got all high-pitched, and I remember yelling at him to stop being so paranoid. Eventually, we both cooled off. Neither of us wanted to cut the trip short, but the tension was thick, like a bad smell that wouldn't go away. That second night was way worse. Around midnight, I heard the laughter again. Closer this time, along with rustling in the bushes around us. I grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. Outside, under the moonlight, I saw these faint shadows flitting between the trees, at least 2 or 3 of them. They didn't make a sound, except for that occasional laughter. Ben woke up and whispered my name. I motioned for him to stay quiet. Then, one of the shadows stepped into the clearing. It looked human-shaped, but the proportions were all wrong. Thin limbs, and a head that seemed a little too long. My flashlight flickered across it for just a second, and it darted away with freaky speed. I can't even say what it was, but it left me shaking. We couldn't sleep after that. We sat by the dying embers of the campfire until dawn, rifles in hand. I'd brought one for bear protection, and now I was really glad I had it. Ben kept muttering about how he should have trusted his gut. I didn't argue with him this time. Day 3 began with this unspoken understanding that we should pack up and go. I tried one more time to reassure Ben. We'll just do one more night. Make sure we leave first thing tomorrow. Maybe a part of me was in denial. I'd planned 4 days out here, and I was just too stubborn to give up. Ben wasn't happy, but he reluctantly went along. We decided to take a closer look at the surrounding area again. We were thinking maybe we could catch a glimpse of who or what was stalking us. Part of me thought it might be a group of real, actual humans messing with us. You know, maybe local teens or even some homeless person who'd wandered deep into the woods. We didn't find any people, but we found more of those symbols carved into trees. They formed a sort of perimeter around our campsite, like we were being slowly fenced in. There was also a pile of stones stacked in these weird patterns, almost like tiny altars. With each new thing we found, Ben got more agitated, and I couldn't blame him. My confidence was totally slipping. Around midday, we were both on edge, snapping at each other for no reason. The tension was brutal. While we were gathering firewood, we heard the laughter again. This time, it was in broad daylight. It froze us in our tracks. We scanned the trees, but saw nothing. That's when Ben finally snapped. "That's it. I'm done. Alex," he shouted, dropping the sticks he'd collected. "I'm going back to the car." We had a huge argument. I told him the car was at least a 2-hour hike away, and it was risky to leave alone with whatever was out there. He argued that staying was even riskier. We yelled, said things we shouldn't have, and then he just stormed off without me. Minutes later, the regret kicked in. I decided to go after him, but he was already too far ahead on the faint trail for me to catch up quickly. Panicked, I started calling his name, but there was no answer. As I pushed through the trees, I realized I didn't even know which direction he'd taken. Then I heard him scream. It was distant, echoing off the pines, but it was definitely Ben's voice. My heart nearly stopped. I ran towards the sound, crashing through shrubs and branches. I called his name over and over, but he didn't answer. Instead, I heard the louder again, like multiple voices, mocking and twisted. The forest started to feel like a maze. Every path I took seemed to lead me back to the same clearing. My sense of direction was failing me, or maybe something was deliberately guiding me in circles. After what felt like forever, I found Ben's flashlight lying on the ground. It was flickering, its beam weakly lighting up the pine needles, but there was no sign of Ben. I yelled until my throat was raw. I searched the area, finding only those bizarre footprints again. Half human, half something else. My mind was racing. Maybe he'd been kidnapped or attacked. Maybe he'd tripped and hit his head. But there was no blood, no sign of a struggle, just that cursed flashlight. Night started to fall, and fear flooded me. Every rustle of branches had my nerves on edge. I headed back to our campsite, thinking maybe Ben would return there, but it was empty, still. The perimeter of carved symbols had grown. More trees bore fresh carvings, forming a sort of circle around the clearing. My breath caught in my throat as I realized they were closer than before. I built up the campfire as big as I could, hoping the light and heat would keep whatever was out there away. Hours passed in a haze of terror. I jumped at every snap of a twig or gust of wind. At one point, I heard a faint voice that sounded like Ben's, but it came from multiple directions at once, surrounding me. I shouted back, nearly crying, "Ben, where are you?" But only my echo returned. Finally, the fire started to die down, and I was too terrified to go look for more wood. The darkness pressed in, and my flashlight kept flickering, like the batteries were about to give out. I huddled by the embers, rifle in my lap, my mind racing through the worst-case scenarios. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ben's terrified face, or that twisted silhouette from the night before. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I dozed off. I jolted awake to the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate steps approaching from behind. I gripped my rifle, spun around, and nearly fell backward in terror. Standing just at the edge of the campfire's dying glow was something, wearing Ben's jacket. But it wasn't Ben. Its posture was all wrong. Limbs too long, head cocked at a weird angle. A wave of cold dread hit me like plunging into ice water. Then it spoke, or tried to. Its voice was a raspy mockery of Ben's, repeating my name. Alex. Alex. I raised the rifle, but my hands were shaking so violently I could barely aim. The figure lurched forward, and I caught a glimpse of its eyes, dark pits reflecting the faint embers. I must have screamed because it let out that same high-pitched laughter, then darted away into the trees, impossibly fast. Panic seized me. I knew I had to get out of there. Forget the gear, forget the plan. I shoved whatever I could into my backpack, doused the fire, and took off in what I hoped was the direction of the car. The forest was pitch black, and I relied on my flashlight's flickering beam to guide me. But the deeper I went, the more lost I became. The undergrowth felt different, like it was shifting beneath my feet. Shadows danced on the edge of my vision, and that laughter trailed me, never too far behind. After what felt like hours, I noticed an orange glow behind me. I risked a glance back and saw that the fire pit I'd left was somehow roaring back to life, an inferno. Flames were licking at the treetops. It made no sense. I'd poured water on it. The glow lit up shapes moving in the distance, figures with elongated limbs, circling the blaze. My heart was pounding in my chest. If the forest went up in flames, I'd be trapped. But if I turned back, I'd be running straight toward those things. I pushed forward, stumbling over rocks and roots. My flashlight finally died, leaving me with only the pale moonlight that filtered through the canopy. Eventually, I stumbled onto a dirt trail. Maybe the one we'd come in on. Relief flooded me. I staggered forward, fighting the urge to collapse. My pack felt like it weighed a ton, but I refused to stop. Night creatures made their calls in the distance, and the wind rustled the trees in a way that sounded like whispers. Then, mercifully, I saw the car. It was barely visible in the moonlight, but it was there. I sprinted the last few yards, fumbled with my keys, and nearly vomited from relief when the engine turned over on the first try. I sped off down the uneven trail, nearly fishtailing in the dirt. I glanced in the rearview mirror once, and I saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me leave. It took hours to reach the main road. By the time I found a ranger station, the sun was coming up. I stumbled inside, babbling about missing people and strange figures in Devil's Den. The rangers took down my statement and organized a search party, but they came back with nothing. No footprints, no campsite, not even a burned area where I'd seen the flames. It was as though the forest had swallowed every trace of us. I begged them to keep looking for Ben, but as weeks turned into months, the search was called off. His family and I clung to hope for a while, but that hope dwindled with each passing day. I tried going back with more skilled search teams, private investigators, anyone who might help, but all they found were a few broken branches and confusing tracks that led nowhere. People ask if maybe Ben just ran off, faked his disappearance. But I know what I saw and what I heard. The forest was alive with something evil that night, and I'd give anything to have listened to Ben's warning sooner. Now, I suffer from insomnia and panic attacks. I can't even look at a photo of a forest without my skin crawling. The nightmares are the worst. I see shadows wearing my friend's jacket, mocking me with that horrible laugh. Sometimes it's Ben's voice, calling me deeper into the woods. Sometimes it's a chorus of voices, urging me to return to Devil's Den. And every time I wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding like a sledgehammer. It's been nearly a year since that trip. The authorities never found a body or any sign of Ben. A few local legends mention vanishings in that area, always blamed on wild animals or the rough terrain. But I believe something else is responsible. Something that no rational explanation can cover. I'm telling my story in the hopes that others will think twice before going into places with names like Devil's Den, especially when the locals keep their distance. I still blame myself. If I'd agreed to leave sooner, maybe Ben would still be here. Maybe we'd be laughing about our close call instead of me waking up in cold sweats every night, haunted by the sound of inhuman laughter echoing in my mind. I've told this to psychiatrists, priests, and even a Navajo elder who listened gravely and told me to stay away from cursed lands. I'm not sure what's real anymore. All I know is that something unnatural lurks in that forest. And if you've read this far, I hope you take my advice. Never go to Devil's Den. Or if you do, don't be stubborn like me. Listen to your instincts. There are places on this earth where no human should tread. Places where the line between our world and something else is paper thin. And if you hear laughter echoing through the trees late at night, turn around. Don't investigate. Don't wait. Just run, because once that ladder finds you, it may never let you go. There are over 23,000 missing persons cold cases in the US currently. That is a chilling statistic. Most missing people are eventually found. Unfortunately, some are not. Ben's disappearance will likely, sadly, become a cold case. If you ever go hiking or camping, please tell someone where you are going, when you will be back, and stick to your itinerary. Be safe. How is the conclusion? I tried to make it impactful, while also reminding readers that this is fiction, but that there are real dangers to consider when exploring remote areas. My name's Alex, I'm 27, and let me tell you, I'm a bit of an adrenaline junkie. Always have been, always will be. It's this thing I have where I just have to chase the next thrill, you know. Well, last autumn, that thrill-seeking side of me landed me, my boyfriend, Ethan, and my best friend, Chloe, smack dab in the middle of a nightmare. We're talking about Superstition Mountain in Arizona. Ever heard of it? Yeah, that place. The one with all the crazy stories about people vanishing and never being found. Sounds fun, right? Wrong. Looking back, I guess I was the one who dragged them into it, but whatever, who cares about the details? At the time, I was all hyped up. Another adventure, another epic story to tell at parties. We were going to conquer the infamous Superstition Mountain. Little did I know, this wasn't going to be some fun little weekend trip. This was going to be the trip that changed everything. So, Ethan, my boyfriend, he's the complete opposite of me. Mr. Safe and Sound. He's the guy who actually reads instruction manuals and knows how to do things like, I don't know, start a fire without matches. He once showed me how to filter water from a mud puddle using a sock. I mean, seriously, who even does that? He's amazing. Though my rock, you know, keeps me grounded when I'm about to fly off into some crazy scheme. Then there's Chloe, my bestie since college. We're two peas in a pod, that one. Except maybe she's the spicy pea to my regular pea. Sarcastic, fearless, and always up for anything. She's the kind of friend who'll jump off a cliff with you and then laugh about it later, even if she broke her leg doing it. Our little adventure started on a Friday morning. We packed up Ethan's trusty Jeep with all the essentials: tent, flashlights, cooking gear, the works. Well, Ethan packed the essentials. Chloe showed up with this joke of a tent. I swear, it looked like it was meant for a toddler's tea party, not an actual camping trip in the actual wilderness. And her water supply, one single bottle. She said she could ration it. I just remember Ethan shaking his head, his jaw clenched so tight I thought he might crack a tooth. He didn't say a word, but the air was so thick with tension you could practically taste it. Great start, right? The drive to Superstition Mountain was a few hours of winding through these dusty desert roads. The sun was just beating down on us, no mercy. But we were laughing, blasting music, just stoked to be out of the city and on our way to an adventure. When we finally got to the base of the mountain, though, I felt this weird chill, even though it was like 100 degrees out. The place just looked off, like it was holding its breath or something. Huge red rocks jutting out all over the place, twisted into these creepy shapes. Cacti everywhere, looking like these silent, prickly guards. I'd heard all the stories, of course. People disappearing, gold miners swallowed up by the earth, entire groups vanishing while searching for lost treasure. But those were just stories, right? Old legends, spooky campfire tales. We were going to be fine. We started hiking up this narrow trail, each of us lugging our gear. Ethan kept telling us to pace ourselves, drink water, all that responsible stuff. Chloe, being Chloe, rolled her eyes and called him a walking safety manual. Then she just stormed ahead, like she had something to prove. I tried to stay out of it, but I could feel this worry gnawing at me. The vibe between them was way off, like a lit fuse just waiting for a spark. By the time we reached our first campsite, a little clearing tucked between these massive rock walls, the sun was starting to set. We set up our tents. Ethan's, of course, was perfect. Sturdy, spacious, the Taj Mahal of tents. Chloe's, on the other hand, well, let's just say it almost collapsed about 5 times while she was trying to put it up. She was cursing a blue streak, but she refused to let Ethan help her. He finally gave up and went to go rig up a makeshift clothesline, probably just to get away from her. And that first night, that's when things started to get weird. Like really weird. The wind picked up, and it sounded like it was whispering. Not just any whispers, it sounded like it was whispering my name. I'd lean one way and hear it. Alex. Faint as anything, but I swear it was there. Ethan said it was just the wind whistling through the rocks, but even he didn't sound too sure. Chloe, trying to lighten the mood, joked that it was probably just the ghosts welcoming us. She laughed, but I saw her fiddling with her phone, desperately trying to get a signal. No luck. Of course. We huddled around a small campfire, the flames casting these flickering shadows on the rocks, making them look even creepier. I tried to ease the tension, telling funny stories about our past road trips, but neither Ethan nor Chloe was really in the mood for laughing. Ethan eventually got up to check our supplies, probably just to avoid the awkwardness. Chloe looked bored, so I started talking about the supposed curse of the mountain. She scoffed, saying the only curse was the dry air messing with her skin. Close to midnight, I heard something rustling outside the circle of firelight. Ethan heard it too, because he froze, his hand reaching for the flashlight clipped to his belt. We peered into the darkness, but we couldn't see anything except the outlines of cacti and rocks. Probably just a jackrabbit, Chloe said, but even she sounded a little freaked out. We decided to turn in, hoping that morning would make everything seem less creepy. Yeah, right, like that was going to happen. Okay, so sleep. Not so much. Around 3:00 a.m., I jolted awake. Footsteps circling my tent. Slow, deliberate. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Ethan was next to me, still as a statue. I thought he was asleep at first, but then he whispered, "I hear it too. Don't move." We lay there, frozen, listening to those footsteps getting closer. And then I swear I heard this thin, scratchy voice humming, like some creepy lullaby. Then silence, just like that. Nothing. Dawn, I crawled out of my tent, fully expecting to see footprints all around, but there was nothing. The ground was mostly rock and scrub brush, so any tracks would have been hard to see, but still, it was weird. We decided to pack up and move further up the mountain, partly because, that's what we came here to do, but also partly to get the heck away from whatever was creeping around our campsite. The hike up was brutal. The sun was relentless, baking us alive as we scrambled over rocky ledges, navigated these dusty switchbacks, and slid on loose gravel. Ethan kept on Chloe about drinking more water. She kept refusing, mostly just to spite him, I think. Finally, she got all dizzy and nearly fell. And that, of course, started another fight. Ethan laid into her about being reckless, and Kello snapped back that he was trying to control her. I tried to play peacemaker, but it was no use. They were like two pit bulls going at it, spitting insults and accusations. Eventually, Chloe just stormed off ahead of us again, leaving us in this heavy, awkward silence. It was early evening by the time we found this plateau that looked like a decent spot for a second campsite. The view was insane. You could see the whole Arizona desert stretching out below, like some kind of alien landscape. It was almost enough to make me forget how on edge I was. Almost. We set up camp in pretty much complete silence. Ethan went off to gather firewood, and I decided to check our water supply. And that's when I saw it. The first real, undeniable sign that something was seriously wrong. There were these weird symbols carved into a rock near where we'd pitched our tents. They looked kind of like hieroglyphics, but more twisted. Crude drawings of stick figures with weird, elongated limbs and circles within circles. My stomach did a flip-flop. Chloe came over, curious about what I was staring at. When she saw the carvings, she let out this nervous laugh, like it was some kind of elaborate prank someone was pulling. Yeah, right? Ethan came back a few minutes later, and when I pointed out the carvings, the blood drained from his face. "Let's pack up and leave," he said, his voice grim. "We can drive back tonight." But I couldn't. I don't know if it was curiosity or pride or just plain stupidity, but I had to know more. I wanted to take pictures, do some research when we got back. Just one more night. I pleaded. "We'll leave first thing in the morning." Ethan reluctantly agreed, but only if we promised to stay alert. Chloe just shrugged like she couldn't care less. But even she was eyeing those symbols with a mixture of unease and, I don't know, maybe fascination. That night, as we sat around our pathetic little fire, the wind died down completely. It left the air feeling strangely still, like the whole mountain was holding its breath, waiting. We weren't even fighting anymore. There was just this shared sense of dread hanging over us, thick and suffocating. And then we saw her. For the first time, she was standing about 20 yards away. An old woman, with this stringy white hair and ragged clothes that blended right into the rocks and scrub. Her face was impossible to see in the firelight. She was just staring at us. I called out, "Are you response?" No response, not a sound. Not even the crunch of gravel under her feet. And then, just as suddenly as she appeared, she was gone. Vanished into the darkness like a puff of smoke. Chloe tried to brush it off. "We're all just seeing things," she said. "It's the heat." but her voice was trembling. Ethan whispered that he didn't like this, that we should leave right now. And for a second, I almost agreed. But something in me, some stubborn, reckless part of me, refused to back down. Leaving would be like admitting defeat, and I wasn't ready for that. We went to our tents soon after, each of us on high alert. Sleep was pretty much impossible. The silence was even worse than the noise from the night before. It was oppressive, suffocating. But eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. Then, in the middle of the night, I heard Chloe scream. It was the kind of scream that makes your blood run cold. A sound of pure, unadulterated terror. That scream, I'll never forget it. It ripped me out of a restless sleep and sent adrenaline flooding through my veins. Ethan and I scrambled out of our tent, flashlights in hand, hearts pounding like war drums. We found Chloe outside her tent, crouched on the ground, clutching her arm. Bright red scratches, deep and raw, ran down her forearm. They looked fresh, oozing, and her tent flap, ripped wide open. She was babbling, saying something grabbed her, something with long, bony fingers. We scanned the area with our flashlights, but all we saw were shifting shadows and the menacing silhouettes of cacti. Nothing moved. Ethan grabbed the first aid kit and started cleaning the wounds. Chloe kept insisting she was fine, that maybe a coyote or something got into her tent. But we all knew that wasn't true. Coyotes don't leave marks like that. They don't unzip tent flaps. And they definitely don't hum creepy lullabies in the dark. Nobody slept for the rest of the night. By morning, we were all running on fumes, strung out and completely freaked. Ethan was more than ready to head back down to the Jeep. Chloe, despite her tough act, looked totally spooked. She was pale, sweating, and her eyes kept darting around like she expected something to jump out at her any second. I realized with a jolt that we needed to get out of there. Now, we started packing up as fast as we could, but before we were finished, Ethan and Chloe got into another fight. This time, it was about which way to go. Chloe, in some kind of fever-induced delirium, wanted to push further into the mountain. She was determined not to be chased off by some ghost story, even though she was the one who'd been attacked. Ethan argued that we'd be risking our lives. Their voices rose, echoing off the rocks in a vicious back and forth that made my head spin. Then, suddenly, Chloe just snapped. She called Ethan a control freak, told him to stay behind if he wanted to, and then she just stormed off into the brush, ignoring our shouts for her to come back. At first, we figured she was just blowing off steam, that she'd cool down and come back in a few minutes. But minutes turned into an hour, and there was still no sign of her. That cold fear I'd been trying to ignore started to grip me tight. We had to find her. Ethan and I grabbed flashlights, water, and some rope, and we set off, calling her name until our voices were hoarse. We found this faint trail leading deeper into the mountain, marked with more of those creepy carvings. And then we found her flashlight, lying there in the dirt, still on, casting a weak beam of light on this twisted, ancient-looking tree. The tree's roots were thick and gnarled, curling above the ground like giant snakes, and the trunk, carved with those same eerie symbols. But Chloe, no sign of her. The sun started to set, and we knew we were screwed. Our water was low, our nerves were fried, and the mountain's oppressive silence felt like it was crushing us. We debated going back for more supplies. Ethan was convinced Chloe had done something reckless, that she'd run into that old woman, or something worse. We were exhausted, defeated, and terrified. We made our way back to our campsite, even though none of us wanted to stay there another minute. We set up a bare bones version of our camp in the near dark, going through the motions like zombies. And that's when Chloe reappeared. At first, I was just relieved she was alive. But as she walked closer into the faint glow of our lantern, I realized something was seriously wrong. Her face was blank, her eyes unfocused, like she was sleepwalking. She didn't respond when we called her name. She just kept walking until she was standing a few feet away from us, eerily still. Ethan rushed over, asking if she was okay, if she was hurt. She just stared right through him. Then she started muttering, gibberish mostly, weird, guttural sounds. Occasionally, she'd say something that sounded almost like English, but it was so jumbled I couldn't make sense of it. Her arm was still scratched, and the marks looked worse. Angrier, redder, almost like they were spreading. We managed to get her to sit down on a rock, tried to give her some water. She took a sip, then spat it out, her eyes wild. I looked at Ethan, pure terror clawing its way up my throat. Was this heat stroke, or something else? Something far more sinister. As night fell, Chloe grew more restless. She started pacing around the edge of our lantern light, muttering those strange words. Then she started calling out to me in her normal voice, perfectly clear. Alex, come here. Come see this. I found something amazing. You have to see it. Every time I'd take a step towards her, Ethan would pull me back. The look on his face told me he didn't trust her. And as much as it killed me to admit it, neither did I. It was like my best friend was gone, replaced by something else. Around midnight, I heard a faint laugh. It sounded like that old woman we'd seen, scratchy but somehow musical. My blood turned to ice, and then Chloe lunged at Ethan. Chloe moved so fast, it was like she teleported. 1 second she was standing there, muttering, and the next she was on Ethan, a blur of motion and fury. She knocked him to the ground, baring her teeth like some kind of feral animal. She was trying to claw at his face, and I swear, her nails looked sharper, longer like claws. Chloe, stop. I screamed, but she didn't even flinch. It was like she couldn't hear me or didn't care. Ethan, even though he was totally caught off guard, managed to push her off, but not before she raked those claws across his shoulder, leaving a deep, bloody gash. Chloe hissed, a sound that was definitely not human, and scrambled back. Then she just bolted into the darkness. We had to follow her. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run the other way, to get as far away from that mountain as possible. But we couldn't just leave her, even if she was different. Ethan, clutching his bleeding arm, grabbed his flashlight, and we stumbled after her. The path, if you could even call it that, led us to this rocky outcropping overlooking a steep drop. The moon was out, bathing the whole scene in this pale, eerie light. And there she was, Chloe, standing right on the edge, her back to us. She was talking, but it wasn't her voice. It was deeper, older, rougher, like someone else was speaking through her. She belongs to me now, the voice said. They all do. My heart was hammering so hard I could barely breathe. I could barely think. Ethan took a cautious step forward, telling me to stay back. Chloe, or whatever was controlling her, turned around. Her eyes, they were black. Not just dark, but completely, utterly black. Like two bottomless pits. And in that instant, I saw something behind her. A flicker, a shadow. The outline of that old woman, shimmering like a mirage. Her hands were on Chloe's shoulders as if she was a puppet. A puppet. That's when it hit me. The old woman, the witch, whatever she was controlling my friend. Before I could even react, Chloe's face twisted into this hateful grin, and she lunged at Ethan again. With a cry that was half rage, half desperation, Ethan grabbed her by the waist and shoved her away. Away from him, away from the edge. She toppled backward, off the cliff. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, but it was her eyes that haunt me the most. Even in that brief moment as she fell, they were filled with rage, with malice. An unearthly shriek filled the air, and I saw the witch's form flicker and dissolve into the night sky like smoke. For a second, I thought Chloe would hit the rocks below. But she didn't. She simply vanished into the darkness, as if the mountain itself had swallowed her whole. 1 second she was there, falling, and the next nothing. Gone. Time seemed to stop. My screams died in my throat. Ethan rushed to the edge, frantically shining his flashlight into the abyss. We saw nothing. No body. No sign of Chloe. It was like she had never even existed. The only sounds were the pounding of my own heart and the whisper of the wind against the rocks. I don't remember much about our frantic descent back to the Jeep. Ethan and I stumbled through the night battered, thirsty, and half out of our minds with grief and terror. By the time we reached the vehicle, the first rays of dawn were painting the sky a pale, washed-out pink. We drove in silence, each of us lost in our own private hell, grappling with what had happened, with what we had to do to survive. When we finally got back to civilization, we went straight to the authorities. We told them everything about the hike, the carvings, the old woman, about Chloe being taken over, about her falling. They launched a search party, of course. Days turned into weeks, and they found nothing. No trace of Chloe. The official report called it a tragic hiking accident. They said she must have fallen somewhere inaccessible. Case closed. Ethan and I tried to explain, to make them understand that it wasn't an accident, that there was something else out there, something evil. But they just looked at us like we were crazy. Eventually, we stopped talking about it. But I can't stop thinking about it. At night, in my tiny apartment, I hear echoes of that unearthly scream. Sometimes, I dream of Chloe, standing on that cliff edge, her eyes empty and black. The guilt is a constant weight on my chest. If only I hadn't insisted on staying. If only I had listened to Ethan. Maybe Chloe would still be here. Even now, months later, I find myself drawn back to that mountain in my mind. Sometimes, I'll catch myself searching online, looking for more stories, more accounts of encounters with the superstition mountain witch. I know it's crazy. Part of me is still searching for answers. Another part wants to make sure no one else goes through what we did. Ethan tries to keep me grounded. He's thrown himself into work, anything to keep busy, to forget. He still nurses that scar on his shoulder, a constant reminder of that night. We rarely talk about it anymore, but sometimes when the moon is full, I catch him staring out the window, that same haunted look in his eyes that I see reflected in my own. I've replayed that final moment 1,000 times in my head. The look on Chloe's face, malicious but still, somehow, my friend. The rush of wind as she fell, that impossible disappearance. The scream that seemed to come from both Chloe and the witch at once. I can't explain it. I can't make it make sense. All I know is that the legends about Superstition Mountain aren't just stories. There's something out there. Something ancient and malevolent. Maybe it's the spirit of a witch, cursed to roam the desolate place, luring in the curious and the reckless. Maybe it's something else entirely, something beyond human understanding. Whatever it is, I can still feel it sometimes, watching me, in my nightmares, in the quiet moments before dawn. I wish I could give you a happy ending, a neat little conclusion to all this horror. But this isn't some campfire story that wraps up with a moral. This is real, and it's still happening. Chloe is gone, swallowed by the shadows of that ancient mountain. And part of me wonders if she's still out there, in some twisted form, wandering those rocky ledges, calling out in the night. Sometimes I think I can almost hear her voice on the wind, beckoning me back, and I know deep down that if I ever return to that cursed place, I might never leave. That's my story. Take it for what it's worth, but if you learn anything from this, let it be a warning. Some places are meant to be left alone. No matter how curious you are, no matter how brave you think you are, there are forces in this world that laugh at our attempts to conquer them. And sometimes, the price of curiosity is far too high. My name is Sarah Jenkins, I'm 27, and let me tell you I've seen some messed up stuff. I'm talking the kind of stuff that makes you question everything you thought you knew. It all went down in Kaibab National Forest, Arizona, and I swear on my life, I'll never forget a single detail, no matter how hard I try. It started with my best friend, Alex, a wannabe photographer, always chasing the perfect shot. He was 28, a year older than me, and way too into creepy folklore. We'd been friends forever, and he knew I loved camping. But this was next level. He wanted to drag me in his beat, up old RV. Seriously, this thing rattled even when parked deep into Kaibab, a place practically buzzing with weird stories, especially about skinwalkers. Alex was obsessed with them. He brought them up every time we talked about the trip, joking half, hoping to catch something spooky on camera. Me, I wasn't thrilled about diving headfirst into a place known for creepy legends. But Alex, he could be persuasive. He talked about photographing the unspoiled wilderness, and how the tall pines and dramatic canyons would make for killer shots. So, I caved. I told myself it would be an adventure, and I did need a break from my dead-end job in Phoenix. Maybe this was exactly the kind of escape we both needed. Famous last words, right? Our troubles started before we even got there. The RV's engine started sputtering the second we left the main highway and hit the dirt road leading into the forest. Alex, ever the optimist, tinkered under the hood while I nervously scanned the tree line. It was crazy how quickly the forest seemed to swallow the sunlight. This place was all deep shadows and looming pines. Seriously, it felt like the forest was watching us. Eventually, Alex got the RV running, or at least making enough noise to move us along. We found a flat patch of earth near some towering ponderosa pines and decided to call it our campsite. No designated spots, no rangers, just us, the rickety RV, and a thick wall of trees in every direction. "This is the real deal," Alex said, stepping out and grinning like a kid in a candy store. "No tourists, no noise, just pure wilderness." I nodded, feeling that weird mix of excitement and unease that always hit me when I was somewhere truly remote. "We should check our gear," I said, trying to sound practical. "It gets cold here at night." Our gear was basic, to say the least. Cheap sleeping bags, a couple of flashlights that flickered when we tested them, a cooler for food, and an ancient generator Alex had snagged from a garage sale. I spotted trouble right away. The generator looked even worse than I remembered, but Alex just shrugged it off. "We'll be fine," he said. "We'll only be here 2 nights." I tried to keep my spirits up. We set up a small table outside under an awning, got some chairs in place, and decided to explore a bit before dark. The forest was beautiful, no doubt about it. Impossibly tall pines, that fresh pine needle scent that reminded me of camping trips as a kid. We followed a narrow path for a while, Alex snapping photos, me admiring the sunlight streaming through the branches. Despite the RV's issues, I started to think maybe we'd made the right call coming out here. Night fell fast. By 7:00 p.m. the sun was gone, and the forest turned pitch black. That's when the first strange thing happened. Alex and I were sitting by our small campfire, laughing about how we'd almost gotten lost, when we heard it. It was a scream, long, piercing, and just wrong. It raised every hair on my body. "Fox?" Alex asked, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice. "Maybe," I said, but I wasn't sure. I'd heard fox calls before, but this was different. It shifted in pitch, moving from high to low in a way that almost sounded human. After a few seconds of silence, I offered, "Could be an elk bugle." Alex chuckled nervously. "Maybe. Come on. You're the nature expert." But the tension stuck to us like a film. I noticed Alex glancing over his shoulder a few times, like he expected to see someone or something lurking in the trees. We stayed close to the fire the rest of the night, speaking in low voices. Eventually, we turned in, each of us crawling into our uncomfortable RV beds. The good times were definitely over. I had this feeling in my gut that something bad was coming. I woke up the next morning to find Alex outside, crouched next to the RV. He motioned me over, his face pale and serious. My stomach dropped. I just knew something was wrong. Huge footprints circled the vehicle. They were shaped like wolf tracks, but way too big, with deep claw marks that made the hair on my neck stand on end. I pressed my hand against one print, and it dwarfed my palm. These things were massive. "What do you make of that?" Alex asked, rubbing his eyes. He looked more tired than I'd ever seen him. "Wolf, maybe," I whispered, like speaking too loudly might summon whatever made them. "But I've never seen prints like this. Could be a bear, but a really messed up one." Alex didn't answer. He just snapped photos, shaking his head. The weirdest part was how deliberate the tracks seemed. They circled the RV twice, then wandered off into the forest, like something had been checking us out during the night, investigating us. Over a breakfast of cold Pop-Tarts, we argued about what to do. Alex, ever the thrill seeker, wanted to stay. He said the prints were probably just from some big animal that happened to pass by. I wanted to move the RV, like yesterday. I figured we should head to a more populated area, just to be safe. Eventually, we compromised. We'd stay one more night, then head closer to the main road. It was a stupid compromise, and deep down, I think we both knew it. It was mid-afternoon when we decided on another hike, but Alex had a different idea. He wanted to wander off alone, convinced that if he could find the animal that made those tracks, he'd get the photo of a lifetime. Yeah, because that's what you do when there's something huge and creepy stalking your campsite. That didn't sit right with me, not at all. I begged him to stick together. He shrugged me off, calling me paranoid. We argued until he slammed the RV door, camera in hand, and stomped off into the woods. I was left behind, feeling a mix of frustration and worry. As daylight started to fade, I regretted letting him go alone. Around 6:00 p.m., I grabbed a flashlight and went a short distance into the forest, calling his name. Alex. Alex, where are you? Nothing. The only reply was the eerie rustle of wind through the pines. The shadows stretched longer as the sun sank behind the canopy. It was getting creepy, fast. By the time I got back to the RV, it was nearly dark. I tried to fire up the generator for some light, but it just gave a sickly sputter and died. Great, I muttered. Now we had no power and no sign of Alex. My heart pounded with fear and anger. Why couldn't he just stay put? Then, out of nowhere, I heard him. Sarah, over here. Relief flooded me. I grabbed my flashlight and rushed toward the voice. Only when I got there, Alex was nowhere to be seen. Instead, I found his camera lying on the ground, its strap frayed like it had been torn. A chill went down my spine. Alex, I called again, shining the flashlight over the bushes and trees. No answer. My mouth went dry. I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe he dropped the camera and wandered off. Maybe he was nearby, just out of sight. But deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. I picked up the camera and flicked through the photos. Most were just trees, some distant wildlife, a few selfies of Alex grinning like an idiot. Then I reached the last image. It was blurred, but in the center was a strange, humanoid figure with glowing eyes. At least, that's what it looked like. It could have been an animal, I guess. Or something else entirely. I felt sick to my stomach. That night was the worst of my life. I sat in the RV, lights off, straining my ears for any sign of Alex. The forest was silent, unsettlingly so. It was like even the insects knew to keep quiet. Around midnight, the screaming started again, closer this time, somehow more twisted. It ripped through the darkness, and the RV began to shake gently, like something was brushing against it. I started crying, tears of fear and frustration. I couldn't see what was out there, and it was driving me crazy. Eventually, the noise stopped, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that blurry figure from the camera, or replayed the memory of those massive tracks circling our campsite. I was trapped, terrified, and alone. This was officially the worst camping trip ever. At dawn, I forced myself outside, a kitchen knife from the RV clutched in my hand. I had to find Alex. I walked in widening circles, calling his name, my voice hoarse. Alex, please, answer me. After hours of searching, I stumbled upon something that made my stomach drop. It was Alex's jacket, ripped and stained with dried blood. A few feet away, I found a clump of hair, human hair. It was dark and short, just like Alex's. I screamed his name then, a raw, desperate sound that echoed through the pines. No reply. For a split second, I considered burying the jacket, the hair. Like if I hid the evidence, maybe it wouldn't be real. But I couldn't do that. I tied the jacket around my waist and kept searching, tears stinging my eyes. That's when I saw it. A shape, tall and gaunt, standing between the pines. I froze, my grip tightening on the knife. At first, I thought it might be Alex. It was his height, and it was wearing his clothes or something like them. Alex, I whispered, my voice cracking. The figure lifted its head. I could see its eyes clearly now. 2 pinpoints of light, unnatural and predatory. Then it spoke, but in a voice that was too flat, too empty. Sarah, over here. It took a step forward, and I realized something was off about its face. It was like it was wearing Alex's face as a mask. Its arms and legs moved stiffly, like they weren't used to having joints. I heard a clicking noise, or maybe a rattle, as it advanced. I ran. I didn't even think about it. I turned and bolted. The path back to the RV was a blur of green and brown. My heart was pounding so hard I thought my chest would explode. When I dared to glance behind me, I saw nothing, but I could still feel the presence of that thing. I'd seen enough to know it wasn't Alex. It might have been wearing his clothes, but no living person moves like that, or has eyes that glow in daylight. Back at the RV, I slammed and locked the door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely think straight. I tried the ignition, praying the old beast would start. It coughed and rattled but refused to come alive. Come on, I begged, slamming my fist against the steering wheel. Still nothing. Outside, I heard footsteps. They circled the RV. From the corner of the window, I saw a shape pass by. The figure paused in front of the windshield, forcing me to duck down so I wouldn't be seen. My heart hammered in my throat. I stayed crouched in the front seat, hoping the tinted glass would hide me. Silence, more circling. Then something knocked on the door. 3 distinct raps. I clamped my hand over my mouth, tears streaming down my face. The knock came again, and a voice called out, "Sarah, it's me. I'm hurt. Open up." It sounded exactly like Alex, but not quite. The tone was too smooth, like a tape recording that had been tampered with. I forced myself to breathe quietly, ignoring the voice. Eventually, the knocking stopped. I didn't hear footsteps leaving, though. That's when I realized it was still there, waiting for me to slip up and step outside. Trapped and terrified, I racked my brain for a solution. If I couldn't drive out, I'd have to escape on foot. But I knew these roads were miles apart. Another plan surfaced. If I could scare it away, maybe I'd have time to fiddle with the engine or find a tool to fix it. Looking around the RV, I spotted a flare gun. It was old, from some emergency kit Alex had packed. I prayed it still worked. The next few hours stretched on in suffocating silence. Whenever I peeked out, I saw nothing, but I could feel the creature's presence like a static charge in the air. It was still out there, waiting. Finally, night came, plunging the forest into darkness once again. My nerves were beyond frayed. Every crackle of branches or rustle of wind made me jump. I was a complete wreck. Just past midnight, the banging returned, this time on the RV's side panel. Something pressed against the windows, testing them. Fear slammed into me like a tidal wave. I readied the flare gun, gripping it with white-knuckled desperation. Suddenly, the door handle jiggled. My heart seized in my chest. Then a voice that nearly broke me. "Sarah, please, it's Alex. Let me in." It sounded so real, so heartbreakingly close to Alex's actual tone. But my mind replayed the image of that unnatural face in the woods. I squeezed my eyes shut, tears sliding down my cheeks. Without warning, the door was yanked, battered by something powerful. The RV shook. I feared the hinges would rip right off. I had no choice. I climbed to the back of the RV, cringing at the awful metallic groans as the creature assaulted the door. My plan, if you could call it that, formed in a half-second decision. If I set the RV on fire, maybe the light and heat would drive it away, or at least buy me time to escape into the forest. It was insane, but it was all I had. I scrambled, rummaging for anything flammable. We had a spare gas can for the generator. My hands shook so violently that I spilled half of it on the floor. The door cracked, splitting near the top hinge. "This is insane," I whispered to myself, tears still in my eyes, but it was the only chance I had. I flicked the lighter and touched the flame to the puddle of gas. Fire flared instantly, bright and hungry, igniting the interior of the RV. Smoke exploded around me, stinging my lungs. I coughed and stumbled for the window. The intense heat spread fast, devouring the cheap upholstery. The banging at the door stopped, replaced by what sounded like a shriek of surprise or anger. I kicked open the back window, my eyes watering from the smoke, and hauled myself outside, hitting the ground in a painful tumble. Flames roared behind me. I saw, for just an instant, a silhouette in the dancing firelight. The shape was tall, elongated, swiping at the flames as if in rage. Then the inferno surged, blocking my view. I ran. I didn't look back, even as the heat scorched the back of my neck, even as I heard that scream again, twisting up into the night sky. The darkness of the forest swallowed me whole, but I kept running until my legs gave out. I collapsed by the trunk of a pine, gulping in the freezing air. My lungs burned from smoke, and my thoughts spun in wild circles. Alex was gone. Really, truly gone. At dawn, I stumbled onto a service road, half delirious from dehydration and terror. A forest ranger found me, wide-eyed and trembling, my clothes singed, and my hair matted. I must have been a sight. After he loaded me into his truck and radioed for help, I tried explaining what happened, though I'm not sure I made much sense. I remember saying, over and over, "He's gone. It wasn't him. It wasn't him." In the days that followed, search parties went out. They found the burnt-out husk of the RV in Alex's camera. They found a scrap of his jacket a few hundred yards away. But they never found Alex, or any sign of a body. Officially, he's listed as missing. The authorities suspect a wild animal attack led to me panicking and torching the RV by accident. I know what I saw, though. That thing was not a normal predator. It walked like a man, wore my friend's face like a disguise, and mimicked his voice, calling my name in a horrifying echo. I've tried to rationalize it, but the nightmares won't stop. Sometimes I think back to those footprints circling the RV and how they seemed to be studying us. It was never just an animal. Something far older, far darker, roams the kebab forest. I live with that knowledge every day, haunted by guilt that I couldn't save Alex, by the memory of that last blurred photo on his camera. There are nights I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I hear his voice outside my window. And maybe it really is him, or maybe it's just my own mind playing tricks. I'll never know for sure. But if you ever find yourself out there, deep in Kebab National Forest, and you hear someone calling your name in the night, someone you know shouldn't be there, don't answer. And whatever you do, don't open the door. You have no idea what's waiting for you out there in the dark. And trust me, you don't want to know. Alright, let me tell you about something that happened 2 summers back that still screws with my head. My name's Alex, I'm 28 now, and this all went down in a place called Black Mesa, Arizona. Sounds cool, right? Wrong. I still get nightmares about it. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever really get away from what we saw out there. If you're reading this, take it as a warning. Some places, they've earned their bad reputation. I went to Black Mesa with 3 of my best friends, Ben, Maya, and Chloe. We'd been doing these annual RV trips since college. The idea was always to pick some remote spot, clear our heads, and get back to nature. You know, the usual. Of course, none of us realized just how remote Black Mesa actually was. Maya, 26 then, was our resident artist and all-around mystical guru. She'd been reading up on local Navajo legends and swore Black Mesa was hauntingly beautiful. She's the one who talked us into this dusty plateau in Arizona, saying it was steeped in strange folklore and would be our best adventure yet. We should have listened to that folklore part a little closer. Ben, 27, was the joker, always cracked wise about anything even remotely scary, especially Maya's thing for curses and desert spirits. Deep down, I think he was a little freaked out, too, but he hid it well behind that grin of his. Chloe, the oldest at 29, was our realist. Total level head. She kept us grounded, took inventory of supplies, and pored over maps. A practical, no-nonsense survivalist at heart, she was ready for real dangers like dehydration or heat stroke. Not so much the freaky stuff from local legends. As for me, I've always been the de facto leader, the fixer. Something broke, someone got hurt, I was your guy. I was organized, always carrying a spare battery pack or an extra fuel canister. I guess I believed that most problems could be solved with the right tools and a calm head. Yeah, well, that confidence was the first thing to go. We rolled into Black Mesa on a Tuesday afternoon. The heat was shimmering on the horizon, making the cliffs and plateaus look like giant, silent guardians. The roads, mostly packed dirt, led us up this winding path toward a plateau where we planned to camp. Cell reception. Gone long gone. No neighbors, no ranger station, just the 4 of us. our RV and a horizon of sharp ridges. We set up camp near a steep drop-off, giving us this insane panoramic view of the valley below. The land was desolate. Yeah, but oddly beautiful under that burning sun. We found a level spot to park the RV and pulled out folding chairs to soak up the sunset. That first night around the campfire was chill. We laughed about old college stories, roasted marshmallows, and teased Maya about her superstitions. She didn't mind. She just looked out at the darkening desert with this dreamy smile, like she was waiting for something mysterious to happen. Morning came with a sun that felt like it wanted to melt us. The plan was to hike one of the nearby trails. Maya wanted to see some rock formations known for what she called ancient symbolism. I shrugged. Whatever made her happy. Chloe carefully packed our backpacks, water, snacks, compass map. Ben ambled behind us, whistling some random tune, cracking jokes about desert ghosts that might come out at night. About an hour into the hike, we realized this terrain was way tougher than we expected. The trails were poorly marked, and jagged rocks made every step a pain. By the time we headed back, we were beat and running low on water. And to top it off, the RV's water pump started acting up. It just sputtered out when we tried to refill our containers. At first, I thought it was just clogged, but after an hour of tinkering, I couldn't fix it. We decided to ration our remaining water until we had a better plan. That night was when things started to feel off. While we were gathered around the fire, Ben pointed out a dark figure standing on a distant ridge. At first, I thought it was a tree or a rock column, but then it moved slightly, like a person silhouetted by the moonlight. Maybe another camper, I said, though it was weird to see someone else that far out. Maya, however, froze. "I don't like this," she said, her voice quiet. Ben tried to joke that it was a cryptid photobombing our trip, but nobody laughed. Eventually, the figure was gone. We told ourselves it was a trick of the light, maybe a hiker passing by. Still, a strange mood settled over us. Long after we'd banked the fire and gone inside the RV, I could feel this unease that kept my heart beating just a little too fast. I fell into a restless sleep, only to be jolted awake sometime after midnight when Maya shook my shoulder. "Alex," she whispered, her eyes wide. "There's someone outside." "Alex," Maya whispered, her eyes wide. "There's someone outside, My heart jumped into my throat. I crept to the window and peeked out. In the moonlight, I could see them footprints circling our campsite. Dozens of them, overlapping, scuffing the dirt. And they were fresh, too, because they definitely weren't there when we turned in. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, half expecting to find Ben playing some stupid prank. But he was right behind me, still half asleep. Chloe shone another beam of light around, illuminating just emptiness and the dusty ground. My gut was screaming that we weren't alone, but there was no one to confront. Eventually, we retreated to the RV, checking the locks. I barely slept after that. Every creak, every rustle of wind outside had me on edge. The next morning, we tried to brush it off. We told ourselves maybe animals had made those tracks, or that we'd done it ourselves by pacing around, or something. We ate a quick breakfast and decided to drive to the nearest town for extra supplies. Only, the RV wouldn't start. I lifted the hood, and my stomach dropped. The engine wires had been deliberately cut, like someone had taken a blade to them. Clean cuts, too. Who the hell would do this? Ben sputtered. He kept looking around, like he expected to spot a vandal crouched behind a rock. Chloe stayed calm, or tried to, but I could see her eyes darting anxiously over her shoulder. Maya just stared at the severed wires, her face pale. That's when it hit us, we were stranded. No cell signal, no way to fix the engine without the right parts that were back in town, a 2-hour drive away. Our only option was to ration supplies and figure out if we could hike out for help. But we decided to give it one more day. Maybe it was some local kid messing with us, and they might come back. Maybe we could catch them in the act, right? It seemed foolish, but we clung to that idea. We didn't want to face the possibility of something more sinister. That night the fear really set in. Deeper. Maya claimed to see symbols in the dirt near our RV, odd circles, lines, and a shape that looked like a spiral. I knelt down with my flashlight and saw faint imprints in the dust. Could have been anything, animal tracks or natural cracks in the ground. But the patterns were too precise, too deliberate. Maya wanted to get out of there, like right then. But nighttime hiking in the desert was risky. Chloe insisted we wait until sunrise. Even Ben was unusually quiet, no longer making jokes about haunted deserts. We locked ourselves inside the RV, each of us unsettled in our own way. I dreamed of footsteps and hushed whispering all around me. When I woke up, it was still dark. A dull headache pulsed behind my eyes. I glanced at my watch at 3:47 a.m. The night stretched on like a living thing, every minute agonizingly slow. At daybreak, we emerged to find that some of our supplies were gone. Protein bars, extra water bottles, a small first aid kit. The door to the storage compartment was hanging open, even though we'd locked it the evening before. At this point, none of us even bothered pretending it could be an animal. How do we fight something we can't see? Maya asked, her voice trembling. Ben put a hand on her shoulder but didn't say anything. For once, he had no jokes. We made the unanimous decision, hike out of Black Mesa and seek help. The plan was simple: walk until we found a road or some sign of civilization. We packed what was left of our food and water, along with flashlights, a compass, and a map. Chloe took the lead. Her background in hiking and survival was the closest thing we had to an advantage. The desert sun was relentless, scorching our skin and draining our energy. By midday, we were parched, rationing sips of water. Every footstep kicked up dust. For hours, we saw nothing but rocks and distant cliffs. Then, we found ourselves facing a deep canyon we hadn't seen on the map. Frustration rose in me. Why wasn't the terrain matching what we'd studied? Chloe took readings with the compass and found it spinning oddly, as though it couldn't find magnetic north. Ben tried to climb a rock formation to get a better vantage point, but he slipped and scraped his knee. He brushed it off, but I could see the worry in his eyes. The land felt strange, like it was somehow shifting around us, like it was messing with us. By evening, we realized we were lost. With the sun setting, we had no choice but to make camp under a rocky overhang. Exhaustion weighed on us like a physical burden. Maya looked like she was on the verge of tears, and Ben had grown distant, staring off into space. "I feel watched," he muttered when I asked if he was okay. "Lake, there's someone behind me all the time." I knew the feeling. My neck tingled, as if eyes were boring into me. That night, we lit a small fire and huddled close, each of us on edge. Maya said she heard voices in the wind, calling her name. Chloe told us to stay quiet and conserve energy. It was like talking to a wall, though. None of us were really listening. Then, out of nowhere, Ben suddenly got up in the middle of the night and wandered away from the light of the fire. I followed him, calling his name, shining my flashlight across the rocks. He stood there in the dark, muttering to himself. I gently led him back. "It's okay," I said, though I didn't believe it. Not one bit. In the morning, Maya was gone. Her sleeping bag lay empty, her backpack untouched. We shouted her name, scrambled around the perimeter for footprints, but found only chaotic scuffs in the dirt. We split up, searching in pairs, but the desert just swallowed our calls. Finally, Ben stumbled upon her journal near a ridge. Pages and pages filled with frantic handwriting, repeating the same phrase over and over. "He is coming, he is coming, he is coming." I remember Chloe standing there, the journal clenched in her hands, looking at me with wide eyes. "Who is he?" she asked, her voice breaking. We were three now, and the tension became suffocating. Ben started whispering to himself, clutching at his temples as if trying to block something out. Chloe tried to keep it together, focusing on practical steps. "Pack up, move out, keep searching," she insisted. We had to try a different direction, hopefully toward a main road or a telephone line. But every path we took seemed to bring us back to the same vantage points. We'd climb a ridge, see a rocky canyon, then descend, only to find ourselves near our old footprints. Time blurred together. I could feel the desert sun punishing us by day, and the cold wind chilling us by night. That evening, I heard Ben's ladder echo through the rocks. It was eerie, high-pitched, nothing like his usual chuckle. Then I saw him vanish around a bend. I sprinted after him, calling his name, but my voice just bounced off the canyon walls. When I reached the spot, he was gone, vanished. As I searched the darkness, I thought I heard footsteps behind me. My flashlight caught a glimpse of a shadow darting away. When I finally returned to Chloe, she was frantic. "Ben just walked off," she said, tears in her eyes. I tried to stop him, but he shoved me and ran. We spent hours calling him, searching with flashlights until our batteries started to die. Nothing, silence. Exhausted, we made camp for the night in a small clearing. We barely slept. I kept hearing faint whispers and glimpses of movement at the edges of our campsite. Every time I raised my flashlight, I saw only rocks and shadows. Sometime before dawn, Chloe shook me awake. She pointed to a silhouette out in the darkness. I squinted and my heart lurched. It was Maya, or something that looked like her. She stood motionless, her back turned. We scrambled to our feet, calling her name. She turned around slowly, but her eyes were glazed, vacant. A shiver ran through me. She lifted a hand, as if beckoning us closer, then vanished into the shadows. We rushed forward, only to find empty space. No footprints, no trace of her presence. By morning, we both felt delirious. Our water was nearly gone. The sun beat down mercilessly, and every breath tasted of dust. We resolved to keep moving, although I don't think either of us believed we'd escape. With the heat rising off the desert floor, our illusions multiplied. I kept seeing Ben or Maya at the corners of my vision, always receding into mirages. We continued hiking, drawn forward by a faint line that could have been a road. Chloe tripped at one point, cutting her leg badly on a jagged rock. I tried to bandage her, but I could feel her trembling. "Alex," she said, her voice cracking, "if we don't get out of here today, we're going to die." As the day wore on, a flicker of hope appeared on the horizon, a solitary figure. For a moment I froze, terrified it was the same presence we'd seen before. But as we got closer, we saw a uniform, a park ranger. He seemed surprised to find us. I wanted to cry with relief. The ranger helped us to his vehicle, gave us water, and radioed for more assistance. I tried to tell him everything about Maya disappearing, Ben running off into the night, the footprints, the cut wires. He stared at us, his eyes full of sympathy and something like dread. "You're lucky I found you," he said softly. "This place, a lot of people won't come here anymore." He didn't elaborate, and I was too weak to press him for answers. Chloe and I clung to each other as we finally left Black Mesa. It felt like we'd been trapped in a never-ending nightmare. But the second we crossed the boundary and got closer to civilization, the desert receded behind us, like a vanishing dream. Chloe had to be hospitalized for dehydration and the infection in her leg. I checked on her every day. We never heard from Ben or Maya again. Search parties combed the area for weeks, with no results. It was as if Black Mesa swallowed them whole. When I asked the ranger what he thought happened, he simply shook his head, saying, "Some places you just don't go." Months later, I'd catch glimpses of shadows in the corner of my eye, a shape on a distant ridge, footprints where there should be none. At night, I sometimes dream of that figure standing against the moonlight, refusing to move. Then I feel footsteps circling my bed, and I jolt awake, drenched in sweat. People tell me it was just the stress, or the harsh conditions, that made us hallucinate. They say that Maya must have run off in a delirium, that Ben got lost in the canyon. Maybe so, but I know what we saw. I know we weren't alone. I still wonder what those symbols meant, the ones Maya found in the dirt, or who cut the RV wires and why. Maybe it was a person, a drifter, someone cruel enough to leave us stranded. Or maybe it was something older, something the desert birthed long before we arrived. Whatever it was, it lingers in my nightmares, reminding me how fragile our sense of safety can be when confronted by the unknown. I haven't returned to Black Mesa, and I never will. Chloe moved across the country, trying to put as many miles between herself and Arizona as possible. We keep in touch, but our conversations are hesitant, always dancing around the topic. Neither of us wants to relive the details. We've lost 2 friends, and even though we have no proof of what happened to them, we carry the guilt of surviving. Sometimes, I look at a map of Arizona and see that barren stretch labeled Black Mesa. I can almost hear the wind howling through the canyons, calling my name. That's when I shut the map and remind myself I'm one of the lucky ones who made it out. But if I listen too closely in the dark, I swear I hear whispering footsteps at my door, a faint reminder that maybe I never really left that cursed place at all. All right, let me tell you about something that happened to me a few months ago. Something I still can't wrap my head around. My name's Mark. I'm 30, and I'm a pretty down-to-earth guy. I like things that make sense, you know. But this messed me up. It all started with my girlfriend, Sarah. She was 28, an artist, and way into all that spiritual stuff, crystals, energy, you name it. Me? Not so much. But Sarah was convinced this place in Sedona, Arizona, called Bell Rock, was some kind of power spot. Vortex, she called it. She said it could open your mind to things you wouldn't normally see or feel. Honestly, I thought it was a load of New Age BS. But Sarah was so passionate about it. She was always telling me about the power of Sedona and how it was full of these spots that could seriously change your perspective. So, like an idiot, I agreed to go on a road trip with her in my beat-up old RV. Sarah kept saying a few days near Bell Rock would be rejuvenating and transformative. She even invited her cousin Ben along. Ben was 27 and, to put it nicely, a bit of a wild card. He loved stirring things up, always looking for the next adventure, no matter how dumb it was. I wasn't exactly thrilled about Ben tagging along, but I figured I could handle it for Sarah's sake. We're trying to keep an open mind and all that. We rolled into Sedona on a hot afternoon. The place is stunning, no lie. Giant red rock formations everywhere, glowing in the sunlight. It felt like another planet. We parked the RV near a little grocery store and headed to a diner for lunch, planning to grab some sandwiches and maybe get some local tips on a good campsite with a view of Bell Rock. The diner was your typical small town place, all cozy with the smell of coffee and grazy food. A few locals were in booths, chatting away. While we were waiting to order, I noticed this old guy at the counter kept giving us these weird looks, like he was sizing us up. Then, he shuffled over to our table, hands all gnarled and weathered. "You kids headed out to Bell Rock?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. Sarah nodded, beaming. "Yeah, we're planning to camp out there for a few nights. Is it as amazing as everyone says?" The old man didn't crack a smile. He just stared at her for a second, then at Ben and finally at me. "Amazing, sure, but there's more to it than meets the eye," he said. "Folks out here, they see things sometimes. Shadows that don't belong. People have gone missing." He paused, like he was waiting to see if we'd freak out. Ben let out a short laugh. "Shadows. I'm not too worried about shadows. I've dealt with worse things from actual people. A spooky rock ain't gonna scare me." The old man's mouth tightened. "Suit yourselves," he muttered, and he walked back to the counter without another word. Okay, I'll admit it, the guy creeped me out. I didn't believe in ghost stories, but there was something in his voice that sent a shiver down my spine. But Sarah, she seemed even more excited, whispering about how the land was probably trying to warn us about something. Ben, being Ben, just rolled his eyes and teased her, saying we shouldn't let some old wives' tale ruin our trip. We finished our sandwiches and went to get supplies. I wanted to stock up on water and all the necessary stuff, but Ben kept saying we were packing too much and it wasn't a big deal. Said he'd done plenty of desert trips, and that there was a creek near the campsite where we could get more water. I wanted to argue, it is a desert after all. But Sarah took his side, said we should travel light, and that I was overthinking it. So we ended up with less than I was comfortable with. By late afternoon, we were driving down this dusty road that led us deeper into the desert. The setting sun made the red rocks around us glow like fire. It was seriously like we'd entered another world. We found a flat spot to park the RV at the base of Bell Rock, far from any main trails. The place was beautiful, I'll give it that. Those huge rock formations towering over us in the fading light. That first night, we made a small campfire, had a few beers. Sarah tried to get us to do this little cleansing ritual thing to honor the spirits of the land. Ben, naturally, made fun of it, humming these fake chants under his breath. But even with Ben's sarcasm, it was a nice night. I remember leaning back in my camp chair, looking up at the sky full of stars, and thinking it was one of the most peaceful moments I'd ever had. The air was warm and still, and for a while, I actually felt relaxed. So, around midnight I decided to turn in, headed inside the RV to get some sleep. Sarah followed me, but Ben said he was gonna stay out a bit longer, watch the embers die down, all that manly stuff. I must have been half asleep when I heard it, 3 sharp knocks on the RV door. Knock, knock, knock. I sat up, heart pounding. Sarah was startled too, blinking at me like a confused owl. We figured it was probably Ben, locked himself out or something. I got up, went to the door, and nothing. No one there. The desert was dead quiet, except for the wind kinda whispering through the rocks. I called out Ben's name, but no answer. I shined my flashlight around, and there was his chair, empty by the dying fire. Right. I closed the door, made sure it was locked. Maybe 10 minutes later, Ben comes stumbling into the RV, smelling like a brewery. He flops down on the little couch, totally oblivious. I asked him if he'd knocked earlier, but he denied it, swore he'd been outside the whole time. Sarah was giving me this worried look, saying she felt something strange nearby. To be honest, I was starting to feel it too. I tried to brush it off as us being tired, and maybe a little spooked by the old man's story, but it was unsettling. We all eventually fell into a restless sleep, full of weird dreams. The next morning, the sun was blasting down, turning the RV into an oven. We all crawled out, groggy and complaining about how badly we'd slept. As I was stretching and walking around the campsite, I noticed something in the dirt tracks. They looked like human footprints, but off. The toes were too long, almost like claws, and they circled the whole RV, a big loop. I pointed them out to Ben, who just shrugged and said it was probably some animal. But Sarah, her eyes were wide. She was totally freaked out. We decided to make breakfast, but when I went to grab the water jugs, most of the water was gone, spilled all over the floor, and get this, the caps on all the jugs were loose, like someone had messed with them. Ben claimed it was an accident, but it was too weird that every single container had been tampered with. Sarah and I exchanged this look like, okay, this is officially not cool. With no water left, we had no choice but to hike to that creek Ben had mentioned. except the short hike turned into an hour of trudging through the blazing heat, and we still hadn't found any damn creek. Ben finally admitted that his memory might be a little fuzzy, that he'd been here years ago, and the creek was probably on the other side of the ridge. Sarah kept saying we needed to conserve our energy, which was starting to get on my nerves. I was getting seriously irritated with Ben's carefree attitude. We were in the middle of the desert, with no water, and he was acting like it was a walk in the park. Eventually, we gave up and headed back to camp, all sweaty and dehydrated. By midday, the generator started acting up. The AC in the RV sputtered and died, leaving us in that suffocating heat. I tried to fix the damn thing, but I could only get it to provide minimal power to the small fridge. No lights, no AC. Ben just laughed it off, calling it part of the authentic off-grid experience. That was the first time I really felt a spark of anger. Sure, I wanted to be in nature, but not like this. Not without any backup plan. As the sun started to set on our second day, a weird hush fell over the desert. The wind stopped completely, and the rocks seemed to loom closer, like they were watching us. Sarah was totally on edge, pacing around the campsite, saying she felt like something was out there, watching her. Ben teased her a little, but even he seemed uneasy. We decided to skip the campfire that night, choosing to stay inside the RV. We tried playing some music from our phones, trying to keep things light, but there was this tension between us, like we were all pretending nothing was wrong when everything felt incredibly wrong. Later that night, I woke up to the RV shaking. The whole thing was jolting back and forth, like something was pushing against it. Sarah sat up, eyes wide with terror. We heard this scraping sound along the side of the RV like claws dragging on metal. Ben jumped up shouting, "Who's out there?" I grabbed the flashlight, flung open the door. My heart was going crazy in my chest. I could barely breathe, and again, nothing. The desert was silent, empty. But just as I was about to close the door, I heard it a whisper. Too soft to make out the words, but it sent a chill straight through me. I slammed the door shut, locked it. Ben wanted to go out and investigate the idiot. Sarah begged him not to, saying she could sense something evil out there, and honestly, a part of me agreed with her. But another part of me was furious. Furious at Ben for being so reckless. Furious at myself for not preparing better. And furious that I was actually starting to believe that old man's warning. We stayed up until dawn, huddled together, armed with anything we could find, a hiking pole, a kitchen knife, a crowbar Ben found in the RV's toolkit. We didn't talk much. The silence was heavy, only broken by our own breathing. When the first light of day finally hit Bell Rock, we cautiously went outside. And that's when we saw it. The damage. The first light of day hit Bell Rock, and we finally got a good look at what had happened during the night. There were these deep scratch marks all along one side of the RV, like something huge had raked its claws across it. And the footprints, those creepy, elongated footprints, they were back. This time they looked fresh, overlapping each other in this weird, zigzag pattern that circled the entire RV. Sarah said it reminded her of some kind of ritual symbol, but she didn't know what it meant. That was it. That was the moment I decided we were getting the hell out of there. No water, the generator was fried, and now this. It felt like the place was screaming at us to leave. I told Ben and Sarah we needed to pack up and head back to town. Of course, Ben objected. He insisted we were overreacting, that it was probably just some desperate coyote or even some prankster messing with us. Sarah was torn. She was obviously scared, but she also seemed worried about leaving Ben to fend for himself if it was something more dangerous out there. In the end, Ben, in his infinite wisdom, convinced Sarah to give it one more night. He said we could do a proper search for water or find a phone signal in the morning. I resented it big time, but I reluctantly agreed. I figured I'd just keep watch all night. That afternoon, I tried to start the RV's engine, just to make sure we could actually leave if we needed to. The ignition clicked, but the engine wouldn't turn over. It had been running fine the day before, so I had no idea what was wrong. I checked the battery, the fuel, the starter, everything seemed okay. But it just wouldn't start. I told Ben about the engine trouble. He just shrugged and said, "We'll figure it out." Sarah offered to help me look at it again after sunset when it was cooler, but I had this knot of dread in my stomach. It felt like we were trapped. As evening approached, Ben pulled me aside and said he was going to take a flashlight and do a little exploring on his own, just around the ridge. "I want to prove there's nothing to be scared of," he said, all cocky. I tried to stop him, told him it was dangerous, that we didn't know what was out there. Sarah begged him to stay, but he just waved us off, that same arrogant grin on his face. "Relax, it's just a short trip. I'll be back before you know it," he said. And then he walked off, his flashlight beam bobbing in the growing darkness. Sarah and I waited. We paced around the RV, not talking much. An hour passed, then two. The desert night felt alive, like there were eyes watching us from the shadows. Every rustle of the bushes, every shift of the wind made me jump. Sarah kept calling Ben's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. At one point, she burst into tears, convinced something terrible had happened to him. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight and told Sarah we had to go look for him. We set off in the direction Ben had gone. The temperature had plummeted, and a sharp wind whipped around us, carrying dust that stung our eyes. We searched, calling his name until our voices were hoarse. Eventually, we found his flashlight, lying on the ground near a rocky ledge, and next to it, face down in the dirt, was Ben's phone. When Sarah picked it up, the screen lit up, and we saw it, a blurry photo. It looked like a shadowy figure, tall and thin, with 2 points of red light where its eyes should be. They were reflecting back at the camera, glowing. It sent a bolt of pure terror through me. Ben had captured something on camera, and whatever it was, I knew it wasn't human. We spent the entire night circling that area, screaming Ben's name, shining the flashlight into every crevice, every shadow. By dawn, we were completely exhausted, physically and emotionally. We stumbled back to the RV, our hearts heavy, our hands trembling. Sarah collapsed on the couch, tears streaming down her face. I tried the engine again, even though I knew it was pointless. It still wouldn't start. The day wore on, and Sarah became increasingly frantic. She insisted we had to do some kind of spiritual ritual to call out to Ben, or at least protect ourselves from whatever was out there. She gathered some crystals she had with her, lit a small bundle of sage, and started chanting these words I didn't understand. I just stood there, feeling utterly helpless. I'd never believed in that stuff, but what else could we do? Our phones had zero signal, and the radio was just static. Late that afternoon, Sarah said she could hear Ben calling her name from outside. I listened, but I couldn't hear anything. She ran out of the RV, ignoring me when I shouted for her to stop. I sprinted after her, chasing her as she ran toward the rocky ridge. The moment she reached it, she froze. I caught up to her, and I saw what she was staring at. In the distance, there was a figure. It looked like a man, but it moved wrong. Too smooth, too fluid. Its limbs seemed too long, and its eyes. Those eyes glowed like embers in the fading light. Sarah let out a gasp, stumbling backward. The figure flickered and disappeared behind a boulder, like a mirage dissolving. She was shaking, whispering. It looked like Ben, but I knew, deep down, that whatever it wasn't him. Not anymore. After seeing that thing that looked like Ben but wasn't, we were completely broken. We tried to barricade ourselves inside the RV that night, exhausted, terrified, and losing hope. Sarah kept mumbling that she could feel Ben's presence, that he was calling to her, lost somewhere out there. Around midnight, I must have dozed off for a few minutes, because I jerked awake to find the RV door wide open. Sarah was gone. My stomach dropped out. I grabbed the flashlight and tore out into the darkness, screaming her name. I saw footprints in the dirt, leading away from the RV, heading toward the ridge. They looked fresh. I followed them, stumbling over rocks, pushing through thorny bushes, my heart hammering against my ribs, so hard I thought it would explode. After about 100 yards, the footprints just stopped, vanished. No sign of Sarah, just that same oppressive silence. It was like the desert had just swallowed her whole. I searched for hours, calling her name, begging any higher power I could think of to bring her back. By dawn, my voice was gone, my throat raw, my body atching from exhaustion. I made my way back to the RV one last time, numb with grief and terror. The sun rose, painting the rocks in these beautiful shades of red and gold, a cruel mockery of the nightmare I was living. In a daze, I tried the engine again, even though I knew it wouldn't start. But this time, it roared to life. Just like that. No hesitation. I stared at the dashboard in disbelief, tears welling up in my eyes. It was as if some unseen force had decided my time was up, granting me just enough to escape alone. I drove that RV out of there like a bat out of hell, not stopping until I was back in town. My mind was spinning, replaying everything: Sarah's terrified face, Ben's cocky grin before he disappeared, those glowing eyes in the distance. When I finally reached a gas station with cell service, I called the authorities. I told them everything, even the parts that sounded insane. A search party went out to Bell Rock, but they never found Sarah or Ben. No footprints, no bodies, no trace of them at all. The desert had reclaimed them. In the weeks that followed, I tried to piece my life back together. The sheriff asked me a million questions. Local news ran stories about missing campers. Friends and family tried to console me, but how could I explain what I'd seen? How could I make them understand that maybe, just maybe, there are things out there that defy rational explanation? I've gone back to Sedona a few times since then, drawn back by this need for answers, for closure. Each time I feel that same heaviness in the air, that silent warning. Sometimes I visit that diner, hoping to see that old man again, the one who tried to warn us, but he's never there. The staff say no one like that works there, or even eats there regularly. It's like he appeared just to warn us and then vanished, just like Sarah and Ben. If there's a lesson in all this, I guess it's that there are some places on this earth where the veil between the ordinary and the unknown is thin. And when you're in those places, you can't just rely on logic or bravery. You have to respect the land, the warnings, the energies, whatever they are. I still have nightmares about Bell Rock, about Sarah and Ben calling to me in the dark. Sometimes I wake up shouting their names, convinced they're just outside, needing my help. But they're never there. And I am left with the memories, the echoes of those knocks on the RV door, the scraping of claws on metal, and the sight of those glowing eyes in the distance. My name is Mark. I'm 30 years old, and I survived Bell Rock. But my girlfriend and her cousin never came back from that place. And no one can tell me why. All I know is that somewhere out there, beyond the towering red rocks and the whispering winds, there's a darkness we don't understand. Something ancient, something that feeds on fear. So, if you ever decide to go to Bell Rock, I hope you think of my story. I hope you remember what happened to Sarah, Ben, and me. And I hope, for your sake, that you turn around before it's too late. My name is Ben. I'm 35 years old, and for the past year, I've been living way off the grid in Arizona's Coconino National Forest. See, I used to be a city boy, stuck in a Phoenix office job that I absolutely hated. I was drowning in spreadsheets and pointless meetings, you know the drill. Then one day, something just snapped. I realized I was craving simplicity, a real connection with nature. I wanted to chop my own wood, catch my own dinner, and sleep under the stars without hearing traffic 24/7. So, I just walked away. I packed up my German Shepherd. Duke left everything behind, and found this little cabin deep in the woods. It's on a bit of a hill, surrounded by these huge ponderosa pines. The nearest paved road is like 10 miles away, which is perfect for me. Life out here is quiet. I get water from the creek. I've got a little vegetable garden going, and solar panels for basic power. It's a world away from my old life, and honestly, it's given me a peace I never thought was possible. I was becoming a hermit, but one with his dog and sanity intact. Everything changed when my little sister, Chloe, decided to visit. She's 29, super practical, and has the biggest heart of anyone I know. She's always been the responsible one, even when we were kids. She called me on my old satellite phone, yeah. I kept it for emergencies, and said she was coming up with a friend of mine from back in the day, a guy named Alex. I was surprised, to say the least. I hadn't seen or even talked to Alex in years, but apparently he was itching for some wild adventure, and Chloe, being Chloe, wanted to check up on me, make sure I hadn't completely lost it out here in the woods. They showed up at the edge of my property in an old Jeep. Chloe hopped out with this warm smile. Her hair was shorter than I remembered, and she had on a serious-looking hiking backpack. Alex came next, wearing this flashy sports jacket and carrying a brand new tent that still had the price tag on it. He was the same as always, loud, full of himself, and kind of looking down on anything he couldn't easily understand. "Man, this place is in the middle of nowhere," Alex said, looking around at the tall pines like he'd never seen a tree before. "You're really living the dream, huh?" "You could say that," I replied. Duke trotted over to sniff Alex's boots, giving him a cautious once-over. Alex patted him on the head like they were old paws, which made me chuckle a little. Chloe set her pack down, rubbing her shoulders. She'd brought me extra supplies, canned goods, a new water filter, batteries, the essentials. We spent the afternoon catching up outside the cabin, laughing about old times. It felt good to have company, even if Alex was a bit much. Then Chloe mentioned this waterfall I'd found a few months back, about a 6-mile hike into the forest. She wanted us all to go check it out the next day. I warned them it was a tough hike, with steep rocks and trails that weren't always easy to follow. But Alex, in his infinite wisdom, insisted on making it an overnight camping trip. He wanted to test out his gear and prove he could handle the Creole wilderness. I should have known then it was a bad idea. So, the next morning, we set out early. Alex's gear looked like it had never been used, all shiny and new, while Chloe had on these well-worn hiking boots and a look that said she meant business. We each had a backpack with food, water, and camping stuff. I also brought a map, a compass, and my rifle. You never know when you might run into a bear or a mountain lion out here. The first few hours on the trail were actually pretty nice. The air was crisp, the sun was filtering through the pines, and Duke was leading the way, his nose glued to the ground. Alex kept joking that all the trees looked the same, and Chloe would gently remind him that it was easy to get lost without a map. Around noon, we stopped for a quick lunch of jerky and trail mix near a small clearing. I noticed the sky was getting dark, with these thick clouds rolling in. Monsoon season in Arizona can be unpredictable, and storms can blow up out of nowhere. And what do you know? Soon enough, the rain started coming down. Not just a drizzle, but a full-on downpour. We were soaked in minutes. We pushed forward, but the trail was getting slick. Those brand new boots of Alex's didn't have the grip he expected, and he slipped more than once, cursing under his breath. Chloe and I tried to help, but Alex's pride wouldn't let him accept it easily. He was acting like a real jerk. By late afternoon, we found a spot to set up camp in a flatter area between some big boulders. Chloe and I worked together to pitch our tents quickly, but Alex was struggling with his. The fabric was thin, and one of the poles snapped the second he tried to put it in the ground. "Cheap piece of garbage," he muttered, throwing the broken pole aside. Chloe offered to share her tent if we couldn't fix his, but he seemed embarrassed. You could tell he didn't want to admit he was in over his head. While we were messing around with the tent situation, I noticed Duke acting strange. He was standing real still, his ears perked up, staring into the trees. Then he let out this low growl that sent a chill down my spine. "What is it, boy?" I asked, peering into the darkening forest. The rain was still coming down hard, and I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. But Duke wouldn't calm down. Eventually, I took him for a short walk around the edge of our camp, just to see if I could spot anything. Nothing. I figured maybe he was just on edge because of the storm. Night came quick. We huddled under a small tarp I'd set up between the boulders to eat some dehydrated soup gourmet. I know. Nobody was talking much, mostly just listening to the rain pounding on the tarp. Then, Duke growled again, even deeper this time. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it around, but all I could see was rain and the outlines of trees. Chloe looked worried, and even Alex had stopped making jokes. He looked nervous. "Probably just a raccoon or something," he said, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. We decided to turn in for the night. Alex's tent was half collapsed, so we did our best to rig it up with some rope and extra poles. It wasn't pretty, but it kept most of the rain out. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was pitch black, and I heard this strange scraping noise, like claws on a tree trunk. Then a soft whimper. Through the thin wall of my tent, I could see Duke's silhouette, his nose pressed against the entrance. I crawled outside, my heart pounding. The rain had stopped, and the forest was eerily silent. I shined my flashlight around and caught the reflection of two eyes, near a fallen log, animal eyes, wide and unblinking. I froze, lifting my rifle. But then the eyes vanished, leaving me with only a faint rustle of movement in the darkness. I was starting to get seriously freaked out. This was not normal, even for the wilderness, and my gut was screaming that something was very, very wrong. The next morning, Chloe and Alex crawled out of their tents, looking like they hadn't slept a wink. Alex was complaining about his sleeping bag being soaked, and Chloe said she'd heard strange noises too, but figured it was just the wind. We packed up our soggy gear, eager to get moving. As we hiked, the trail became even more messed up. Rocks were jutting out at weird angles, and fallen trees from the storm made it hard to find a clear path. My map said we should be heading east, but the forest seemed different. It was like the whole landscape had shifted overnight. Then Chloe noticed something weird: animal tracks. They looked like coyote prints, maybe, but they were way too big and kind of stretched out, like they were made by something unnatural. Alex, of course, just laughed it off. "It's probably just a wolf or a big cat," he said, trying to take photos with his phone. But there was no signal, and his battery was almost dead from the cold. We kept going, but the feeling that something wasn't right just kept getting stronger. Then we smelled it, the stench of something rotten. We followed the smell, and that's when we found it, a deer carcass, but it was mutilated in a way that made my stomach churn. The bones were arranged in a circle, the ribs pointing outwards like some kind of messed up crown. Chloe gagged, and even Alex turned pale. Duke whimpered, his tail tucked between his legs. "What the hell did this?" Alex asked, his voice shaky. None of us had an answer. I mean, bears or mountain lions might scavenge a kill, but this... This looked deliberate, like some kind of ritual. We got out of there fast, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that was settling over us. By late afternoon, the clouds were gathering again, threatening another storm. We decided to make camp, even though we weren't sure if we were still on the right path to the waterfall. The map said we should be close, but nothing looked familiar. While Chloe and I were setting up, Alex wandered off to find firewood. He came back empty-handed, complaining that everything was too wet to burn. Chloe offered him a small bottle of lighter fluid, but at first he refused, too proud to admit he needed it. Finally, he gave in, drenching a pile of sticks. The fire sputtered to life, casting long, flickering shadows around our campsite. As darkness fell, the forest became eerily quiet. We were miles from any road, surrounded by nothing but trees and the flickering light of our small fire. Chloe and Alex started arguing about missing supplies. A whole bag of trail mix and a folded map had vanished. Alex swore he hadn't touched them, but Chloe was sure she'd put them in his pack. "Enough," I said, trying to keep the peace. I'd seen how quickly things could spiral out of control when people were tired and stressed. "We'll figure it out tomorrow." A little after midnight, I woke up to a rustling sound outside my tent. Duke was standing at the flap, staring out into the darkness. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent, and stepped out carefully. The fire was down to embers, casting a dim glow around our campsite. Alex's tent was empty, the flap wide open. Chloe's tent was closed, but I could see her silhouette moving inside, probably woken up by the noise too. "Alex," I whispered, but there was no answer. A wave of panic washed over me. I scanned the tree line, my heart pounding. Every hair on my body was standing on end. Duke started sniffing the ground, heading away from the camp. Chloe emerged from her tent, pulling on a jacket. "Where's Alex?" she asked, her voice trembling. We followed Duke through the trees, stepping over roots and rocks. The moon was nearly full, casting just enough light to see by. After a few minutes, I spotted Alex's flashlight on the ground, the lens cracked. I picked it up, noticing a dark smear on it, blood, maybe. My pulse was racing. Then we heard a muffled sound like a human voice crying out. "Alex," I shouted. No answer, but then the faintest whisper, or maybe it was just the wind. It was impossible to tell where it was coming from. We searched until dawn, calling Alex's name over and over, but we found nothing. Exhausted and terrified, we returned to camp. Inside Alex's tent, we found his sleeping bag torn open, like it had been ripped by claws. Chloe sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face. She blamed herself for bringing him on this trip. I tried to reassure her, but my own fear was growing. This was something more than just a simple animal attack. Something was very wrong here. At sunrise, we made a decision: we couldn't stay. We packed up what we could carry and started heading back towards the cabin, hoping to get help. But the trail, it seemed to have vanished. Landmarks I remembered were gone, or maybe I was just too tired and shaken to recognize them. Even the compass was spinning strangely, like it couldn't find north. Duke kept barking and growling, always staring at something just beyond my line of sight. It felt like the forest itself was working against us, trying to keep us trapped. Around mid-morning, Chloe grabbed my arm. Listen," she whispered. A voice in the distance called out. It sounded like Alex, but the pitch was off, almost mechanical. "Help, over here, please." The words echoed strangely, as if coming from multiple directions at once. My blood turned to ice. Duke growled, and Chloe looked at me, her eyes wide with terror. If it was Alex, we had to help him. But there was something horribly wrong with that voice. It was like a recording, devoid of any real emotion, just repeating the same phrase over and over. "Help over here, please." I told Chloe to stay behind me, and I raised my rifle. We followed the voice, each step feeling heavier than the last. We reached a small clearing. The voice stopped abruptly. There was no one there, only a circle of flattened grass and what looked like fresh footprints. Then I saw it, a tall, humanoid figure crouched among the trees, almost blending into the shadows. It stood up, towering over us, its skin pale and stretched over impossibly thin limbs. Its face was partially hidden in the gloom. Chloe stifled a scream. Duke barked furiously. The figure let out a hiss, turning to reveal a face that looked disturbingly like Alex's, but only for a split second. Then it melted away into something monstrous. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. I fired the rifle into the air as a warning. The creature emitted a screech and darted back into the forest with impossible speed. We didn't hesitate. We ran. We ran back to our campsite, hearts pounding like crazy. I knew what I'd seen couldn't be explained by logic. An old Navajo man I met months ago had warned me about legends of skinwalkers, shape-shifters that could mimic voices and appearances. I dismissed them as myths back then, but now I wasn't so sure. Chloe was in shock, her breathing ragged. "What the hell was that?" she whispered. "I don't know," I said, though deep down, I had a sickening feeling I did. "We have to get out of here." We grabbed our packs, leaving behind anything that wasn't absolutely essential. We had one goal: reach the highway. It was at least a day's walk if we kept a steady pace, but the forest seemed to twist around us. A second storm was brewing overhead, making everything even more disorienting. Duke barked sporadically, as if sensing the presence of that creature or something else entirely lurking just out of sight. As we hiked, we heard the voice again. "Help, over here, please." Sometimes it sounded like Alex, sometimes like me, and sometimes even like Chloe. Each time it sent a jolt of fear through us. We ignored it, pushing forward, focusing on any recognizable landmarks. The terrain grew steeper and more dangerous. Rocks shifted beneath our feet, and the thick canopy blocked most of the light. Rain started again, turning the ground into slick mud. We slipped repeatedly, and once I nearly lost my footing on a ledge. Duke barked, pulling at my pant leg as if telling me to be careful. Late in the afternoon, we stumbled upon a small cave. The sky was darkening, and lightning flashed in the distance. We decided to take shelter briefly, even though the idea of hiding in a cave terrified me, just as much as the open forest. We crouched inside, the damp walls pressing in on us. Chloe clung to Duke, trying to calm her shaking hands. I used the moment to reload my rifle, just in case. Suddenly, lightning illuminated the cave entrance, and I saw something move outside, just a flicker of a silhouette. My throat tightened. Then we heard it, the unmistakable sound of scratching on rock, followed by low, guttural breathing. Chloe covered her mouth to stifle a scream, and Duke began a relentless growl that rumbled like distant thunder. I motioned for Chloe to stay behind me, rifle at the ready. A twisted shape appeared at the cave mouth, standing upright but hunched, as though its spine couldn't fully straighten. Its skin was pale in the flashes of lightning, eyes glinting like an animal's. It opened its mouth, and we heard Alex's voice again. "It's me, I'm hurt. Let me in." It took every ounce of willpower not to respond, not to move. The creature shuffled forward. I could see elongated fingers scraping the stone, and it smelled like rotting leaves. I fired a shot above it, hoping to scare it off. The gunshot echoed, and the creature screeched, retreating into the storm. For a moment, we just sat there, hearts pounding. We couldn't stay in the cave much longer. We needed to keep moving. Summoning our courage, we stepped back into the torrent of rain, heading downhill, hoping to find the river that led to the highway. Night descended quickly, so we used flashlights to guide us. The forest was alive with strange noises, branches cracking, leaves rustling, and that unnerving mimicry somewhere behind us. Chloe tripped on a rock and cried out, twisting her ankle. Duke sniffed around her anxiously. I helped her limp forward, fighting the urge to collapse into panic. We walked until our legs burned, finally emerging onto a faint dirt path. I recognized it as an old fire road, which meant it might eventually connect to the main highway. Relief surged through me, but we still had miles to go. The rain lessened, giving way to a misty fog. Our flashlight beams cut through the haze, revealing the path a few yards at a time. Near dawn, we spotted a shape on the path up ahead. At first, I thought it was another person, maybe a park ranger. But as we moved closer, I realized it was that thing again, standing motionless. It tilted its head in an unnatural way, almost curious. I raised my rifle, my heart pounding in my chest. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice shaking. It took a slow step forward, ignoring my warning. Something glinted in its hand, Alex's flashlight, the cracked lens reflecting our beams. I felt sick. Chloe gripped my arm so hard it hurt, but I couldn't lower the rifle. I fired a shot directly at the creature this time. It let out a blood-curdling scream and staggered, then dropped to all fours and bolted into the trees, leaving the flashlight behind. We didn't look back. We just ran, pushing our exhausted bodies along the dirt road until at last, we saw the faint glow of early morning light hitting a patch of asphalt, the highway. We'd made it. Collapsing onto the shoulder, we sat gasping for air. Duke lay beside us, equally spent. I looked around, expecting the creature to appear again, but the forest was silent, except for the wind in the pines. We waited for hours, hoping a car would pass. Finally, an old pickup truck rumbled by, and we flagged it down. The driver, a kindly rancher, took one look at us, soaked, filthy, and terrified, and offered to drive us to the nearest hospital. Chloe clung to Duke in the back seat, sobbing quietly. I filed a missing person report for Alex as soon as we found the nearest sheriff's station. They organized a search party, but they didn't find any trace of him, except for some shredded gear and faint footprints that disappeared into the woods. Days turned into weeks, My cabin was out there, untouched, but I couldn't bring myself to go back. Chloe returned to Phoenix, and I stayed for a short while at a small motel near the forest's edge. I tried to make sense of what happened, telling myself that Alex got lost, that an animal might have attacked him. But at night I heard his voice in my dreams, that same monotone echo from the forest. Help. Over here. Please. Eventually, I decided I couldn't live off grid anymore. The forest that once felt like home now haunted me. I packed what little belongings I had left and drove away, Duke beside me, still glancing nervously at every rustle of leaves. I left the cabin behind. I left the solitude and the simple life for good. I don't know what happened to Alex. I don't know if that thing I saw was real, or if I'd reached some breaking point. All I know is that something malevolent lurks in the depths of the Coconino National Forest. Maybe it's an ancient legend, maybe it's just my own guilt and fear. Either way, I'll never go back, and I'll never forget the sound of that voice calling to me in the darkness. My name's Mike Johnson, 35 years young, and I'd traded the whole city rat race for the Sonoran Desert. Yeah, you heard that right. Traded skyscrapers for saguaros. I'd been living off grid in my beat up RV for almost 2 years, miles from anywhere, just me, the sun, and the howling wind. I was after some peace and quiet, some clarity, you know. The kind you only get when there's nothing but endless sand and cacti stretching out to the horizon. My RV was my little kingdom, parked way out there where the paved roads just give up and disappear. Honestly, I didn't expect to see another soul in that godforsaken place. Then, one day, Sarah showed up. I remember it like it was yesterday. The sun was starting to dip, painting the whole rocky landscape in this crazy golden light. That's when I saw her, this figure walking towards me, kinda shimmering in the heat. At first I thought, man, I'm seeing things. Heat does that out here, messes with your eyes. But she kept getting closer, and I realized it was a woman, all dusty in hiking gear, her backpack clinking with canteens. She looked beat, totally wiped out, but like she was on a mission. When she got close enough to hear me, I stepped out of the RV, shading my eyes with my hand. She called out, her voice kinda raspy. Sorry to bug you, Sarah. Any chance I could fill up my canteens? I'm almost dry. Now, I'm no social butterfly, never have been. That's kind of the point of living in the middle of nowhere. But even a hermit like me knows you don't turn someone away from water in the desert. This place can kill you quick if you're not careful. So, I nodded and motioned for her to follow me. Inside the RV, it was cramped, but it was a little cooler than outside. She let out this huge sigh of relief and downed a whole glass of water in like 2 seconds flat. Then she thanked me about 1,000,000 times. Her voice was shaking, either from being so tired or so dehydrated, or maybe just from the sheer relief of finding someone. Seriously, I appreciate this, she said. I was out there trying to document some desert plants, but I got turned around. Everything starts to look the same after a while. I told her my name was Mike and offered her a place to crash for the night. She took me up on it. We ate some beans and jerky, gourmet, I know, and then sat outside on these rickety folding chairs. watching the last bit of daylight fade away. Sarah mentioned she'd seen some weird markings carved into some rocks about a mile south. Like spirals and circles, she said. On some jagged lines, symbols, I guess. Didn't look like any Native American stuff I've ever seen. I listened. My interest piqued, but I didn't make much of it at the time. It was only later that night, when I went out to grab some extra firewood near a bunch of boulders, that I found it. The duffel bag. It was half buried under some rocks, zipped up tight and heavy. The second I saw how carefully it was hidden, this alarm bell went off in my head. People hide all sorts of things in the desert, and it's usually not treasure. Sometimes it's bodies, sometimes it's stolen goods. I should have just walked away. Ignorance is bliss, right? But nope, I had to open it. Inside, there were these bricks of what I was pretty sure was cocaine, and stacks of cash, all bundled up with rubber bands. My heart was going crazy, pounding so hard I thought my ribs would crack. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what the hell I'd stumbled into. Was it just dropped there by some smugglers? Or was someone coming back for it? I quickly covered it back up, telling myself I wanted nothing to do with it. I came out here for peace, not trouble. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about that damn bag. When I got back to the RV, Sarah was half asleep, so I didn't say anything. I lay down in my own bunk, but sleep was a no-go. Around midnight, I thought I heard something outside. Footsteps. Not like an animal scurrying around, but real measured steps, like someone was circling the RV. I froze listening, my heart hammering. Then after a few seconds it was gone. I figured I was just being paranoid, that it probably was just Sarah, but when I looked over, she was fast asleep, arms crossed over her chest. That was just the beginning. Things were about to get a whole lot weirder. The next morning, Sarah filled up her canteens, getting ready to head out. She thanked me again, but she seemed kinda spooked. She said the night had felt too quiet, like all the animals had disappeared. I knew what she meant. I'd noticed it too. Even the coyotes, those yappy little guys that usually howled their heads off before dawn, were silent. Something felt off, like the whole desert was holding its breath. After Sarah left, I went back to check on the duffel bag. At first glance, everything looked the same. But then I saw them fresh footprints, leading right to the hiding spot. They definitely weren't mine, and they were bigger than Sarah's. My chest tightened. If there were people out here looking for that bag, I needed to be ready. I wasn't about to play cat and mouse with criminals. By noon, I saw a dust cloud on the horizon, a big, black SUV, tearing across the desert like a bat out of hell. I wasn't exactly prepared for a showdown, but I grabbed my rifle and ducked inside the RV. The SUV stopped about 50 yards out, and 3 guys got out. One of them, a stocky dude with a shaved head and a silver cross hanging from his neck, started yelling in Spanish, telling me to come out. His eyes were cold, furious. "Don't be stupid," he shouted in English this time. "We know what you found." I swallowed hard and stepped out slowly. The guy with the shaved head introduced himself as Hector. He didn't waste any time with small talk. Another guy, this one with a face tattoo, pointed a pistol at me, while the third started rummaging around the RV. They didn't find anything inside, so Hector demanded to see the bag. I didn't know what to do. Lying seemed pointless, so I led them to the rock pile. The second Hector saw the drugs and money, he spun around and glared at me. "You steal anything, gringo?" "No," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Didn't touch a thing." He didn't believe me. He grabbed the collar of my shirt, pulled me close, and hissed that this desert was cartel territory. I could feel his spit on my cheek. "Stay away from our stash," he said. "You try to move it or call the cops, you're dead." They left as fast as they came, fishtailing their SUV back into the heat. My heart hammered in my chest for a good 20 minutes after they were gone. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me to pack up and get the hell out of there. But that was easier said than done. I'd poured my life savings into this off-grid setup, and I didn't exactly have anywhere else to go. So I tried to calm myself down by tidying up the RV and taking a short walk. That night, the desert was even quieter than the night before. I could hear my own breathing echoing in my ears, and then I heard them faint whispers coming from behind the RV. It didn't sound like any language I knew, more like this raspy, hollow sound, like wind blowing through a rusty pipe. But it had this dark edge to it that made my skin crawl. I stepped outside with my flashlight, scanning the area. In the distance, something darted behind a cactus. Too fast to be human, too big to be a jackrabbit. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I swore I saw this tall figure with these unnaturally long limbs. Then the beam steadied, and the shape was gone. My pulse was thundering in my ears as I backed into the RV and slammed the door shut. I tried to tell myself it was just the heat playing tricks on me, or that I was on edge because of the cartel guys. But deep down, I knew something else was out there. I barely slept that night. When I finally did doze off, I had these nightmares, these crazy dreams of half-seen creatures skulking around in the desert, scratching at the walls of my RV. I woke up in a cold sweat. Sure, I heard voices calling my name, but when I looked outside, the horizon was empty. A few days later, Sarah came back. She was practically sprinting towards my RV, her face pale and gaunt with fear. She said she'd been seeing strange lights at night, these orbs moving just above the desert floor, and hearing chanting that echoed off the rocks. And, even worse, she said someone, or something, had been following her. She'd been finding more of those weird spiral markings carved into the sand, she said, always just behind her, like they were appearing out of nowhere. Her panicked story just fed into my own fears, but I tried to keep my voice calm. "It's probably just locals messing around," I lied. "You know, bored kids or something." She just stared at me, clearly not buying it. I felt bad for brushing her off, but I didn't want to scare either of us any more than we already were. We both agreed it was time to get out of there. We'd pack up and drive out at first light. Problem was, when morning came, neither of our vehicles would start. My RV just sputtered and died, wouldn't even turn over, and Sarah's Jeep wouldn't even click. We popped the hoods, checked the batteries, but everything looked fine. It was like some force had just drained them dry in the night. We were trapped. So there we were, stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no way out. We spent that afternoon poring over an old tattered map, trying to figure out a plan. That's when I saw him. A figure standing on the ridge across the valley. I grabbed my binoculars and focused in. He was wearing ragged clothes and standing perfectly still, like a statue. A wave of dread washed over me. Something about him just felt wrong. "Sarah," I said, my voice low. "Check this out, Dot." She took the binoculars and looked. What the? We decided to go check it out. Maybe he knew something, maybe he could help. It was a long shot, but we were desperate. We climbed up to the ridge, but by the time we got there, he was gone. No footprints, no trace, nothing. Just the faint smell of sulfur in the air. What was that? Sarah whispered, her eyes wide. "I don't know," I said, my heart sinking. "But I don't like it." We were walking back, trying to make sense of it all, when we heard a voice behind us. "You should leave this place." We spun around. It was a man, tall and lean, with this shock of white hair. He was wearing a threadbare jacket that looked older than I was. He introduced himself as Jacob. His eyes seemed to bore right into my soul. I couldn't tell if he was a friend or a foe. "What do you know about this area?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jacob gave a small shrug. "I know the desert doesn't forget," he said. "It doesn't forgive trespassers either." Then he fixed his gaze on me. "You disturbed something that wasn't meant to be found." I wanted to ask him more, to get some answers. But before I could, he just walked off, disappearing behind a rock formation. We hurried to follow, but he was already gone, vanished into thin air, just like the guy on the ridge. Sarah and I exchanged worried looks. We both knew we were in way over our heads. That night, Sarah slept on the RV's pull-out cot, and I took the driver's seat, shotgun in hand. Around 2 a.m., I jolted awake. There was this scraping sound on the RV door. My heart leaped into my throat. I looked over and Sarah was gone. "Sarah," I called out, scrambling out of the RV. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the area. The wind carried a faint, hollow moan that seemed to mock my desperation. Her footprints led away from the RV into a rocky canyon. I followed them, carefully, the moonlight casting these eerie shadows on the ground. About 100 yards in, her footprints just stopped. No sign of a struggle, no other footprints. Nothing. It was like she'd been lifted straight into the air. Then I saw it, a single scrap of paper lying on the ground. I picked it up and read it by the moonlight. It was in Sarah's handwriting. "Don't follow me," it said. "It's already too late." My stomach twisted into a knot. "Sarah," I yelled, my voice raw with panic. I spun around, shining my flashlight in every direction, but there was nothing. Just rocks, shadows, and that awful silence. Then I saw them, etched into the canyon wall, claw marks. Huge ones, at least 4 feet long, carved deep into the rock. My breath hitched in my throat. These markings, they looked exactly like the ones Sarah had described. The spirals, the circles, the jagged lines. I stumbled back to the RV, my mind racing. What had happened to Sarah? Had the cartel found her? Or was it something else? Something that made no sense in the logical world I thought I knew. I sat in the RV, stunned, trying to piece it all together. A few hours later, as the first rays of dawn painted the desert in hues of pink and orange, I heard the roar of an engine. An SUV. It was Hector and his men. They looked rough, even angrier than before. "Where is she?" Hector demanded, his eyes blazing. "Where's the girl?" I could only shake my head, telling them she was gone, that she had vanished. They didn't believe me. They called me a liar. Hector looked like he was about to shoot me right then and there. Instead, he ordered his men to tie me up. They dragged me out into the open desert, ignoring my pleas. The sun was already scorching hot. They bound my hands and feet, leaving me face down in the sand. Hector leaned down, his voice a low growl. "You and that girl stole from us," he hissed. "If she's gone, you'll pay her debt." Then they left, vowing to return after they'd found their property. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, sweat dripping into my eyes, my mouth full of grit. The desert heat was unbearable. And then I felt it again, that strange hush, that oppressive quiet that made even the insects disappear. A shiver ran down my spine, despite the heat. Suddenly, I heard screams. Terrified, agonizing screams. Men's screams. I recognized Hector's voice among them. Through the shimmering heat haze, I saw them, stumbling in the distance, their guns clattering to the ground. They were clawing at their faces, like they were swatting at invisible insects. One man fell flat on his back, convulsing, and then I saw it, this dark shape looming over him, flickering in and out of sight like a mirage. It was as if the desert itself had come alive to claim them. Just as quickly as it started, the screaming stopped. The shapes in the distance vanished. The silence returned, heavier than before. My stomach churned. I struggled against the ropes, a panic fueling a surge of adrenaline. I rolled onto my back and, using a jagged rock, started sawing at the ropes, tears stinging my eyes from the pain in my raw wrists. Finally, I was free. I stumbled over to where the men had been. The ground was scuffed and littered with footprints, but all three men were gone. Their SUV sat there, doors flung open, engine still running. The only sign that something horrific had happened were these blackened scorch marks on the sand, like lightning had struck just inches away. I felt no relief, only dread. Whatever was out here had swept in without warning, leaving behind evidence of a power I couldn't hope to understand. My mind was reeling. Was it the duffel bag that had sparked this curse? Had I awakened something ancient when I found it? Was it the cartel's violence that had attracted this dark force? And most importantly, what had happened to Sarah? I didn't dare stay to look for answers. With shaking hands, I gathered my supplies from my RV and threw them into the cartel's SUV. The engine was still hot, purring like a docile beast. I drove away, grimacing at the emptiness of the passenger seat. Images of Sarah's anxious face and that haunting note swam in my vision. I couldn't accept that she was gone for good, but the terrifying truth was, I had no idea where to even start searching. As I sped down the dirt track, I couldn't help glancing in the rearview mirror. Every so often, I thought I saw a tall figure standing in the distance, framed by heat waves. Was it Jacob? Was it something else, watching me flee? The swirling dust behind me made it impossible to tell. I floored the accelerator, hoping to put as many miles as possible between me and that cursed patch of desert. When I finally hit a paved road, I checked the map on the passenger seat. No towns for miles. My lips were cracked, my arms sunburned, and a metallic taste of terror coated my tongue. Part of me felt like I should go to the nearest police station, but I knew better than to mention stolen drugs or a missing woman in Cardinal territory. That was a death sentence, so I drove, and I kept driving, stopping only when exhaustion overtook me. Eventually, I traded the SUV for an old pickup truck in some dusty border town, paying cash so I wouldn't leave a trail. Days bled into weeks. I made it to California, found a cheap motel to gather my thoughts. But at night, I'd jolt awake, convinced I heard the scratch of claws on the windows, or the thudding footsteps of cartel enforcers. Sleep offered no escape, only nightmares. I didn't dare contact anyone, not that I had anyone left to contact. My old life was gone, replaced by this constant, knowing paranoia. Everywhere I went, I half expected to find more of those symbols carved into walls, more footprints materializing behind me, or a whisper in that unearthly language echoing down an empty hallway. I was haunted, not just by my memories, but by the certainty that whatever lurked in that desert might still be watching me, waiting for a chance to pull me under. I tried to move on, to build some semblance of a life. I picked up odd jobs under the table. I rented a dingy studio apartment, but no matter how many locks I put on the door, I never felt safe. In every reflection, I saw the wide, terrified eyes of a man who knew the world was bigger and darker than he ever imagined. Some nights I woke up in a cold sweat, the memory of Sarah's final words, "Don't follow me, it's already too late," ringing in my head. Finally, I sought out a local, some guy who claimed to know about desert legends. He lived in a rundown trailer outside of town, filled with dusty books and strange artifacts. He was the first person I dared to tell my story to, leaving out only the drug details. I told him about Sarah's disappearance, the monstrous footprints, the shadows that snatched men from under the blistering sun. He listened quietly, then handed me a worn pamphlet about ancient desert spirits, malevolent entities that supposedly guarded sacred grounds. "Sometimes the land gets cursed," he said in a hushed tone. "Could be anything, a grave, a ceremony site, disturbed, stolen relics. You might have stumbled onto it. These forces don't like intruders. They'll chase you, might even follow you. But often they wait, letting fear do their work." I left feeling worse than before. The idea that this curse might be following me, that Sarah's disappearance might be part of some ancient retribution, was almost too heavy to bear. But everything I'd seen confirmed that something beyond human explanation had intervened. I also thought about the Cardinal men, how they'd vanished, leaving behind nothing but scorch marks. Whether that was justice or cosmic cruelty, I couldn't decide. Now, months later, I'm still looking over my shoulder. Whenever I see odd shapes in the distance or hear an inexplicable whisper in the wind, I freeze. I sold my RV for scrap. Couldn't even look at it without remembering that horrifying moment. I realized something was knocking at my door late at night. I often jolt awake and see a fleeing shape at the foot of my bed, gone the moment I switch on the lamp. I tell myself it's just my imagination. Yet, I still feel eyes on me, silent watchers from some realm I can't comprehend. I don't think the desert has forgotten me. Sometimes I'll see a coyote with glowing eyes standing motionless under a streetlight, staring in a way that suggests it recognizes me. Or I'll find a symbol scratched into a wall that matches the spirals Sarah found. Each instance sets my heart racing, but I can never prove it's more than coincidence. Despite it all, I can't bring myself to dismiss the horrors I experienced. There are places in this world that defy reason, places that harbor old powers, hungering for trespassers' souls. I touched one of those places the moment I found that duffel bag. Whether it was the drugs, the money, or pure misfortune that triggered the chain of events, I'll never know for sure. But I do know I lost more than my peace of mind out in that desert. I lost Sarah and maybe a part of my humanity. If I ever close my eyes and see her again, standing in that moonlit canyon with those claw marks beside her, I'll remember how quickly everything can fall apart. And if there's one lesson to be learned from my time in the Sonoran Desert, it's this: isolation can protect you from people, but it can't protect you from the ancient, watchful darkness that lurks where civilization refuses to tread. I still wonder if she's alive out there, wandering in some hidden corner of the desert, or if she became one with whatever malevolent entity claimed her. I don't know if I'll ever get answers. Perhaps some mysteries are best left unsolved. The only thing I can do now is keep running, though a nagging sense of inevitability tells me that one day, the desert might decide it wants me back. And when that day comes, I doubt I'll have the strength or the luck to escape again.